Chapter 216, Medicinal Power. Chapter 216, Medicinal Power. Seeing how careful the ugly man was, Han Li felt embarrassed from trying to find an opportunity from him. He had no better option than to revoke his original intention of teaching him a lesson. After all, apart from the ugly man's previous rudeness to him, he had made no other great offenses toward him. With this thought, Han Li's expression relaxed as he insipidly said, "Since there's nothing else, I will take my leave." With that said, Han Li departed, light as a feather. For a very long moment, the ugly man looked at Han Li's departing figure and finally gave a long sigh. He then mumbled to himself, "This is truly against reason." He hid himself inside the earth fire room and casually secluded himself, succeeding in Foundation establishment. As for me, how could I, who found a quiet room and a great amount of supplementary medicine pills, not actually succeed? No wonder. Since this person has been accepted as martial ancestor Li's disciple, it seems his aptitude is certainly beyond normal. The ugly man actually blamed Han Li's success on heavenly talent. If Han Li himself heard this, he would perhaps bitterly laugh without end. At this moment, Han Li had already left Yue Lu Hall. The two individuals guarding the transportation formation had already been exchanged with two others. Otherwise, if they saw Han Li suddenly reach Foundation establishment from Qi condensation, they would have likely been astonished. Han Li slow drove his flying magic tool through the sky, without the slightest of worry, as he thought back to his experience of entering Foundation establishment. When Han Li had finished refining the Foundation establishment pills 5 months before, after some deliberation, he felt that undergoing Foundation establishment in the Earth Fire room wasn't a bad idea. At the very least, he wouldn't need to worry about others suddenly intruding and interrupting his seclusion, forcing him to leave things half-finished. Thus, with his mind made up, Han Li consumed one of his original 3 Foundation establishment pills, and then began to make use of medicinal power spreading throughout his body. The power of the Foundation establishment pill flared very quickly. After several short hours, Han Li felt a small inferno roaring and steadily growing inside his dantian. All the other parts of his body felt colder than ice. Altogether, he felt a completely distinct feeling of ice and fire. However, this feeling only continued for a short amount of time before the inferno in his dantian disappeared without a trace. The rest of his body also returned to its normal temperature, causing Han Li to be a bit stunned. After a moment of bewilderment, Han Li's complexion greatly changed as he placed his hands against his dantian without letting go. Because at that time, a fierce pain similar to 7 or 8 daggers simultaneously ripping into him occurred. Not prepared for this in the slightest, Han Li became incomparably pale, slack-jawed, and beaded with sweat the size of soybeans, while his entire body bent into a complete curl. While Han Li was painfully curled into a ball on the floor, he was raining curses in his heart. Why did the people who gave the pill to him never mention the pain that came after taking the Foundation establishment pill? But without even completing his curses, the sharp pain in his dantian suddenly turned into an explosion. This explosion turned into countless threads of warmth, immediately flowing throughout his body's meridians and reaching even the marrow of his bones. But the warmth then turned into a strange, unbearable itch, as if there were countless ants crawling all over his body. This caused him to want to bang his head against the wall and slightly alleviate his suffering. This torment that nearly caused Han Li to go mad continued for the time it took to eat a meal before it gradually diminished. At this moment, Han Li was finally able to support himself against the corner of the wall and stand with much difficulty. Sweating profusely, he was completely covered in a layer of an indescribable gray substance. Furthermore, it was sticky and emitted an unspeakably strange odor. Symbol 361 degrees, symbol 35C turn glottal stop, symbol 361 degrees. However, Han Li didn't care about this at all. What was on his mind was that his cultivation had progressed to the 12th layer. Furthermore, he was comfortably warm from head to toe without the slightest of discomfort. It was very clear that the Foundation establishment pill from before had already improved his bodily structure, cleansing his marrow and replacing his tendons. As for the warmth in his body, it should be residual medicinal power of the Foundation establishment pill. However, after he absorbed it, he used it to increase his magic power. This must be the reason why disciples seclude themselves for 3 months after taking the Foundation establishment pill. Otherwise, this medicinal power would gradually fade away after time had passed. Han Li now started truly following the steps laid out by those in Foundation establishment and sincerely sat down, absorbing the residual medicinal power. However, Han Li quickly discovered that the bits of residual medicinal power that remained in his body could only slightly deepen his magic power and could not again be used to improve his physique. If it were only one foundation establishment pill, after cleansing the marrow and replacing the tendons, none would naturally let this good opportunity to increase one's magic power pass by, so they would seclude themselves for 3 months to thoroughly absorb the medicinal power. They naturally wouldn't easily abandon it. However, Han Li was not the same. He had great amounts of foundation establishment pills on hand. These bits of residual medicinal power weren't enough to enter his eyes. What he was concerned with was improving his physique several times, eventually entering foundation establishment. After all, cleansing the marrow and replacing the tendons was the crucial point of breaking through foundation establishment. After sitting in meditation for over 10 days, Han Li clearly understood this. Naturally, he did not have the patience to wait several months before taking his second foundation establishment pill. After some contemplation, he came to the conclusion that taking consecutive foundation establishment pills shouldn't cause any large problems. At most, there should be an excess of residual medicinal power, but this was nothing. After pondering several more times, he took a second foundation establishment pill without waiting any further. These was a similar pain and a similar tingling itch. Han Li, who was already prepared, still suffered greatly. However, Han Li had already felt this before, and the sensation seemed to feel slightly lesser than before. However, the impurities that were released from his body were not small. It seemed that his aptitude was truly terrible. After taking his second consecutive foundation establishment pill, Han Li did not feel anything strange about the residual magic power in his body. Naturally, the warmth in his bones felt slightly stronger. There weren't any problems at all. Furthermore, his magic power had leaped to the 13th layer, the peak of qi condensation. As such, Han Li started organizing his thoughts. He shouldn't take the foundation establishment pills one after another. Each medicine pill had a similar effect of cleansing one's marrow, further releasing more impurities inside Han Li's body. However, when he took the third pill, Han Li clearly felt the foundation establishment pill's marrow cleansing effect decrease noticeably, discharging less and less impurities. But at the same time, the true essence and magic power within his body underwent a fantastic change. The original condition of his true essence, after undergoing several foundation establishment pill, had gradually consolidated, changing further into liquid. After his 7th foundation establishment pill, apart from a small area at the core of his dantian, his true essence had turned completely into liquid. However, after taking the 7th foundation establishment pill, the residual magic power in Han Li's body approached saturation. The original feeling of warmth throughout his body had now turned into a scorching heat, causing Han Li to hesitate. He truly did not know if whether or not chaos would stem from the great amount of medicinal power released once he took the 8th foundation establishment. But Han Li felt that he was truly close to reaching foundation establishment. It was perhaps only 1 or 2 pills away. After slight contemplation, Han Li's thirst for foundation establishment won over, and he took his 8th foundation establishment pill. However, when this medicine pill entered his belly, the residual medicinal power that he was barely able to control cried out, suddenly exploding. This heated up the meridians throughout Han Li's body, causing his consciousness to become faint. However, when Han Li woke from his scalding body, he discovered a pleasant surprise. While he was unconscious, he actually succeeded in breaking through, already entering foundation establishment. Exhilarated, Han Li immediately thought of jumping into the air to release his excitement. But when he straightened his back, his entire body heated up and he once again fell to the floor, causing him to become greatly scared. Although he had entered foundation establishment, the residual medicinal power of the 8th pill was not eased in the slightest and still flowed throughout his body. It was still very much dangerous. Under his current circumstances, he immediately cultivated and absorbed his medicinal power. Otherwise, it could explode once again at any time. Although Han Li clearly understood the method of resolving this crisis, he was still incessantly grumbling inwardly, without the slightest of happiness. Apart from the Azure Essence Sword art Han Li had on hand, what other foundation establishment cultivation method did Han Li have? With just a look at his newly accepted master and how negligently he treated him, one could tell how crappy this cultivation technique was. Furthermore, Han Li had already flipped through the book several times and made a few inquiries to others. This sword art was truly common. Nearly all the Foundation establishment disciples of Yellow Maple Valley had refined 2 or 3 layers. However, none continued to cultivate deeper than 3 layers. Han Li didn't clearly ask about the specific reason, but the worthlessness of this sword art could be clearly seen. Under these circumstances, although Han Li did not want to cultivate it, he could only force himself to. With no better option, he took out the Azure Essence sword arts and spread it out in front of him. Then he sat cross-legged and cultivated in accordance to the book. This Azure Essence sword art spanned through 9 layers. The first 3 layers could be cultivated by Qi condensation disciples. The middle 3 layers and last 3 layers could only be cultivated by Foundation establishment and core formation cultivators. Furthermore, for every 3 layers cultivated, one could use a divine ability exclusive to that sword art. After cultivation the first 3 layers, without using a magic tool, one could use a single palm to release a sword streak about 3 meters long. Its power wasn't bad, capable of contending against high-grade magic tools. After cultivating the middle 3 layers, one could release a protective sword shield on one's body in an instant. Although its defensive power was about the same as an elementary mid-grade defensive talisman, it could counterattack with a sword streak. When the sword shield received an attack, a sword streak would automatically be released to counterattack. As for the last 3 layers, Chapter 217, Sword Art. As for the divine ability upon completion of the last 3 layers of the sword art, it was the Sorchido Phantasm technique. The prerequisite to cultivating it was the possession of a flying sword magic treasure. Of course, flying sabers were also acceptable. After completely cultivating it, when using this divine ability to deal with enemies, one could borrow the sword light from the flying sword to create an illusion of a sword shadow completely identical to the flying sword. This could interfere with the enemy's line of sight and attack the enemy along with the original sword. Although the sword shadow's initial formation had only 10% of the strength of the original sword, as one increased the sword art's layer, its strength could increase. When it reached the 9th layer, it would have reached 1/3 of the original sword's strength. In addition, when cultivating the sword shadow, one could produce not just one illusion. From the 7th layer onwards, every additional layer one reached would allow one to produce an additional sword shadow. In this way, once one reached the pinnacle of the Azure Essence sword art, one could have 3 shadows that appeared to be identical to the original sword, yet only had 1/3 of its strength. As such, it seemed that the divine ability, the Sorchido Phantasm technique, was worth cultivating. But Han Li already knew that there definitely must be something fishy about this. Even though Yellow Maple Valley had so many Foundation establishment cultivators, nobody had taken the time to deeply cultivate this technique. Thus, he deeply regretted not listening clearly back then to reason behind the sword art's lack of popularity, only believing that he definitely would not cultivate this Azure Essence sword art. Thus, he had casually and carelessly passed over it. Now, although Han Li clearly knew that this magic technique had a great problem, he couldn't help but to summon his courage and cultivate it at least once. He could only hope that this technique would not have any kind of consequence that would cause him to become obsessed. However, after thinking closely about it, although other people had not deeply cultivated it, they still succeeded with 2 or 3 layers. In this way, it seemed like there shouldn't be a big problem with cultivating it a little bit. Holding on to these self-assuring thoughts, Han Li helplessly took in the medicinal strength, about to flare up within his body, according to the method of the Azure Essence sword art. Han Li had only rotated his cultivation technique once before feeling a sudden rumble. The feeling that he got when his absorption of the medicinal power caused his magic strength to rise greatly almost made him cry out in happiness. Immersed in this kind of marvelous feeling, Han Li couldn't help but allow the magic technique to rotate one time after another, as his consciousness slowly slunk off to a faraway place. After sitting there for an unknown length of time, and having cleaned out the last bits of medicinal strength in his body, Han Li finally regained consciousness from his wonderful experience. The now sober Han Li stared somewhat sluggishly for a moment, but immediately afterwards he stood up without saying anything. Then he squinted his eyes and tilted his head, thinking for a moment. He suddenly raised his arm and gestured in front of his body, and an azure, misty sword streak a few feet long instantly shot out of his finger. Its chilly aura was incredibly threatening, and it appeared to be incomparably sharp. Seeing this cold light, Han Li actually did not feel happy. Instead, he began to laugh bitterly. Then, with a sudden shake of his hand, the azure light actually expanded ferociously, in an instant becoming roughly 10 feet long, almost piercing the rock wall on the other side. Damn it, I didn't expect that the remaining medicinal power would be so strong. I actually cultivated to the 4th layer of the sword art in an instant. Who knows if there will be any big side effects? Han Li whispered to himself with a cloudy and uncertain expression on his face. No matter, at most I just won't cultivate this sword art in the future anymore, Han Li muttered, then let his arm fall. The azure-colored sword streak completely disappeared. However, Han Li's curiosity had been greatly piqued, and he still picked up the Azure Essence Sword Art Manual and flipped through the sections related to using the sword as a shield to protect the body, committing them to memory. Then Han Li lowered his head and contemplated in silence, closing his eyes. Immediately afterwards, he abruptly opened his eyes, and a strange shield appeared around his body. This azure-colored shield was very similar in size to other defensive items, but its outer appearance was not the usual smooth shape. Instead, it appeared to be like a porcupine, with sharp streaks protruding from it. In addition, it seemed to be emitting faint traces of some kind of evil spirit. This is the protective sword shield. Han Li carefully inspected the spiked shield in front of him with a certain amount of astonishment. The sword manual says this shield can autonomously send out sword streaks and counterattack opponents. What a pity that I have no way to test it out right now, Han Li thought regretfully. Next, Han Li moved his hands and feet, then closely inspected the true essence inside of his body. After discovering that there truly did not seem to be anything wrong, he relaxed and carefully put away his possessions, leaving the earth fire room. Then, he just so happened to directly run into the ugly man. When he thought of the ugly man's shocked expression towards him, Han Li couldn't help but laugh in his heart in midair. At this time, the sky was growing lighter, and Han Li returned to the 100 Medicine Garden. He didn't run into a single person the entire time. Back then, when he had used the excuse of finding a location to undergo closed-door foundation establishment cultivation, the medicine garden naturally returned to the hands of the little old man. This caused him to feel extremely unhappy, and he had spent much time blowing his beard and staring. When Han Li entered the garden, the little old man was absorbing the spiritual chi from his surroundings with his eyes closed in front of his cottage. Although he did not open his eyes, he still accurately yelled out Han Li's name. This was unsurprising, considering that due to the restrictions on the 100 Medicine Garden, apart from the little old man, only Han Li could enter or leave as he pleased. However, right when this senior martial Uncle Ma had called out Han Li's name, he suddenly felt something and abruptly opened his eyes, staring at Han Li in disbelief. You actually successfully reached the foundation establishment stage. Senior Martial Uncle Ma, this disciple truly luckily entered the foundation establishment stage. Han Li bowed in greeting courteously and said with a gentle laugh. Although the little old man stared blankly with shock for some time, he slowly returned to normal. However, he still muttered to himself. This is too unbelievable. He actually entered the foundation establishment stage. After he murmured these 2 sentences, he suddenly corrected his expression and said with respect, "Since we are both foundation establishment cultivators right now, you don't need to bring up the 3 words, Senior Martial Uncle, anymore. From today onwards, we should refer to each other as Martial Brothers. Since I am somewhat older, if Junior Martial Brother does not despise it, you can just call me Senior Martial Brother Ma." Upon hearing this, Han Li nodded with a smile and did not oppose it. This kind of determining seniority based upon one's realm was a tradition of the cultivating world. This was nothing to be modest about. Following, the little old man, who was also Han Li's senior martial brother Ma, entered the room together with Han Li. Then, they each sat down at a table and began to steep a pot of good tea. They had not been sitting for long when the little old man impatiently asked about how Han Li had reached the foundation establishment stage. Han Li naturally would not tell the other person the real circumstances. However, he did not hide that he achieved foundation establishment in the earth fire room, obediently revealing it to the other person. This was because, if the other person investigated even a little, he would be able to easily discover this matter. He only said that he had rented an earth fire room from Yue Lu Hall, then swallowed the foundation establishment pill that the sect had given him and cultivated behind closed doors for near a year. He did not know how, but somehow he luckily succeeded. As he listened raptly to what Han Li said, the little old man clicked his tongue Z's incessantly, calling the situation strange. When he had heard the story that Han Li had told him, he blinked his eyes and said to him, "Junior Martial Brother Han, from what you said, your experience of reaching the foundation establishment stage is not too different from other people. Even you could reach foundation establishment with this kind of a natural ability. All I can say is that Junior Marshall Brother was extremely lucky. Even a success rate of 1% is enough for you. In the past few years, the little old man had become very familiar with Hanley, so when he spoke he was very direct and did not conceal his envy towards Hanley. In fact, even a jealous expression was emerging from his face. This can only mean that I, Junior Marshall Brother, am extremely lucky. I also did not expect that I could enter the foundation establishment stage so easily. Hanley laughed and said with a grin. However, since Junior Marshall Brother Han has successfully reached the foundation establishment stage, you have to let the sect head know so that Sect Master Zhang can record your name down on the books. In this way, Junior Marshall Brother will be treated according to how high-level disciples are treated, and the amount of spirit stones one receives after reaching foundation establishment is not trivial, said the little old man in a joking manner. Much thanks to Senior Marshall Brother's pointers. When Han Li heard this, his expression changed, and he said this sincerely. This can't count for much. No matter how you see it, we have known each other for so many years. The things that I should remind you of I will do my best to tell you, said the little old man casually, waving his hand. In reality, after reaching the foundation establishment stage, the best benefit that the sect gives is still allowing foundation establishment disciples to pick at a location in the Tai Yue mountain range. There, one can create their own cave and undergo isolated cultivation. Furthermore, following, the little old man explained to Han Li in detail many things that one should pay attention to upon entering the foundation establishment stage, causing Han Li to nod his head continuously as he listened. But when the other person had finished explaining these things and was leisurely conversing with Han Li couldn't help but ask him about the Azure Essence Sword Art. Azure Essence Sword Art. A surprised expression flashed across the little old man's face. But after he had deeply glanced at Han Li, he didn't question him further. He thought for a while and then opened his mouth. This Azure Essence Sword Art, I truly have heard others talk about it, and a few have actually cultivated it to the 3rd layer. This sword art is not actually a technique from our Yellow Maple Valley. Instead, it is a technique from a sect that we had extinguished many years ago called the Profound Sword Sect. In addition, it originally was not 9 layers, but rather 13. Reportedly, when the Profound Sword Sect master saw that his sect was about to be extinguished, he wanted to destroy the sword art right then and there. But a few of the martial ancestors from our sect were not slow in making a movement, forcefully seizing half of the technique. The remaining half was destroyed and lost forever. Thus, the version of the Azure Essence Sword Art being circulated is only a fraction of the whole. At most, one can cultivate it to the core formation stage before there is simply no way to continue cultivating it. From hearsay, the complete sword art could be cultivated even up to deity transformation stage, but who knows if that is true or not. The little old man spoke up to hear while waggling his head, then reached his hand out and picked up the teacup in front of him to take a drink. Then, he continued to say, although the Azure Essence Sword Art, missing its later stages, is somewhat inferior when compared to other first-rate cultivation techniques, its strength is truly still not bad. The instantaneous characteristics of the sword streak and protective sword shield are even more sought after by a significant number of foundation establishment cultivators. Thus, if it was so easy to cultivate it, a significant number of people all over the sect would be willing to cultivate it as their main technique. After all, the techniques of the nascent soul stage are too far away from us, and we would have no way of using them. Chapter 218 Pros and Cons. Chapter 218 Pros and Cons. When Senior Marshall Brother Ma spoke up to hear, he stopped for a moment. An expression of regret surfaced on his face, and he continued to say, unfortunately, after one cultivates this sword art to a deep layer, there is an intolerable flaw. Starting from the 4th layer, when using the Azure Essence Sword Art to absorb spiritual chi from the environment, every few days the strange phenomenon of one's cultivation scattering will occur. A small portion of the magic power that one gained from cultivating this magic art will bafflingly dissipate on its own a few days later. This has truly stumped many people. The speed of loss at the 4th layer of this sword art is not too frightening. Only 1/10 of the newly cultivated magic power will dissipate. If one were to spend even a little effort, common cultivators would still be able to make up for it. But if one steps into the 5th or 6th layer, the rate of loss of spiritual power would be frightening. An additional loss of 1/10 is added on every layer, causing one's bitterly cultivated magic power to continue to greatly dissipate. That is also to say, 20% of newly cultivated magic power will be lost at the 5th layer of the sword art, and 30% at the 6th layer. In this way, who would still dare to cultivate the Azure Essence sword art? In addition, the highest layer of the Azure Essence sword art that our sect's disciples used to cultivate was the 6th layer. Above the 6th layer requires that one must be at the core formation stage to cultivate it. However, when this kind of cultivation technique reached the 6th layer, one would already lose close to a third of one's spiritual power. How could these experts still dare to take this incredible risk? If at the 7th layer of the Azure Essence sword art one still continued to lose a huge amount of spiritual power, wouldn't these experts be incredibly wronged? One has to know that progressing one layer in a core formation stage cultivation technique is much harder. This Azure Essence sword art is already incomparably difficult to cultivate. Nobody would be willing to waste 10 or so years or even decades to take this incredibly stupid risk. Even more, this Azure Essence sword art is fragmented and incomplete, and it isn't some kind of divine technique. There simply isn't enough motivation for them to take this risk. However, this sword art's sword streak divine ability is truly very practical. Simply giving up on it like this is somewhat of a pity. Thus, some people will only cultivate the first 3 layers of the Azure Essence sword art, and it has since become a very successful supporting technique. Thus, one doesn't need to worry about losing one's cultivation and can still continue to use the sword streak divine ability. Of course, even if one only cultivated the sword streak divine ability, it would require these disciples to spend 4 to 5 years of solitary cultivation to achieve it. After hearing the little old man's lengthy explanation, Han Li could only stare with his mouth open. When he finally regained consciousness, he only felt a bad taste in his stomach. It couldn't be. He had already cultivated to the 4th layer of the sword art. According to what the little old man said, if in the future he wanted to continue cultivating the Azure Essence sword art, 1/10 of the magic power he cultivated would dissipate for no reason. In addition, the deeper the layers, the more the loss of magic power would accumulate. How could he continue to cultivate like this? However, since everything had become very clear, no matter what, he would not behave foolishly and continue to cultivate. Cultivation of the Azure Essence sword art would end here. Han Li had not made this decision for long before the little old man's next words moved Han Li's heart again, and he felt that there was something off. Although the Azure Essence sword art has such a great drawback, it still has its own unique characteristics. Otherwise, it would not have become the signature technique of a sect back then. The little old man suddenly remarked with some regret as he pressed his lips together. I once heard someone say that, although cultivating this sword art is extremely slow, every time one successfully cultivates a layer, one may enlarge their meridians and have profound, wonderful effects on the Danshin. This causes the magic power of cultivators that have cultivated this sword art to be somewhat more profound than that of a cultivator of the same level. But exactly how much more profound can it be? This depends on how many layers of the sword art one has cultivated. But based on records from before, the only disciple that cultivated this Azure Essence sword art to the 6th layer, when he reached the foundation establishment stage, had magic power roughly a third greater than that of other cultivators in his level. This extra magic power was exactly the same amount as the magic power that he had lost while cultivating the Azure Essence sword art. This kind of coincidence must be mentioned. This sword art is truly somewhat profound. The little old man had seemingly studied this Azure Essence sword art quite a bit, and the more he spoke, the more his spirits were lifted up. Afterwards, spittle was even flying from his mouth, and he was very animated. This caused Han Li to hurriedly bring up some other matters, forcibly changing the subject from the Azure Essence sword art. Only then did Senior Martial Brother Ma return to normal. To Han Li, even if this sword art had any other marvelous characteristic, he still would not cultivate it. His aptitude originally was already not good. There must be something wrong with his brain if he intentionally cultivated this extremely slow, incomplete magic technique, unless he did not want to reach core formation. Even with those common cultivation techniques, Han Li reckoned that if he were to discover a few medicinal recipes, there was still somewhat of a possibility of him reaching core formation. Han Li chatted with the little old man for a while longer before taking his leave. Now that he had reached foundation establishment, he naturally could no longer watch over the medicine garden for the other person. Thus, he returned to the cottage that he normally lived in. After a little bit of cleaning up, he swiftly headed towards it. At the time, the sky was very bright, making it the perfect opportunity for him to go to the official hall and take care of business. The excitement in Han Li's heart had yet to retreat completely, since he had just reached the Foundation establishment stage. His only thought was that he would take care of his business, then immediately open up a cave for himself. Han Li had looked forward to this for a long time. After all, once he had his own patch of ground, he wouldn't need to be stealthy anymore no matter what he did, and he could do whatever he wanted in his own area. The more Han Li thought about it, the more excited got. In no time, he had unconsciously arrived at the council hall. The two young disciples guarding the big door obviously didn't recognize Han Li. However, they had clearly seen with a glance Han Li's identity as a Foundation establishment cultivator. Thus, they naturally did not dare to delay Han Li just because he was young. The two people stepped forward simultaneously and immediately bowed to Han Li, showing their respect. "This martial uncle, is there something that you need us to help you with?" "Martial uncle." When Han Li heard this, he thought it was somewhat funny. If he had met these two people a year ago, perhaps he would even have to call them senior martial brother. Today, his status had greatly increased because he had reached Foundation establishment, and he immediately became their senior. Han Li felt that he was not used to it. However, seeing these people, whose ages were similar to his, greet him with such respect, he felt pretty good. "Is Sect Master Zhang here? I have something I need to discuss with him," Han Li said arrogantly. These two Qi condensation disciples couldn't help but glance at each other after hearing Han Li say this. The person on the right then replied, "Sect Master has gone to the 100 Opportunities Hall to take care of business, but he should be back quickly. How about Martial Uncle wait for a moment in the Pavilion Hall?" Han Li slightly knitted his eyebrows, but immediately returned to normal and said carelessly, "Okay, since it's like this, I will just wait for a bit." "Great, Martial Uncle, this way please." The other person was also very clever, and he took 2 steps backwards, then led Han Li there. Following this person, Han Li passed through the large lobby and was brought to a slightly larger room in the hall. Not only was this room extremely clean and tidy, a few pen and ink drawings were hung on the 4 walls, creating an elegant, scholarly atmosphere. "Martial Uncle can wait first here for a moment. When the sect master returns, this disciple will immediately report to him." The youth skillfully poured a pot of fragrant tea for Han Li, then retreated. Han Li nodded his head as he watched the youth's retreating figure, but then shook his head. He first nodded because he felt that whether it was this youth's eyes or his bearing, both caused Han Li to feel great satisfaction. It was as if he had no flaws, and that he had undergone a special training to get this kind of a face. But when he shook his head, it was because he felt grieved for these low-level disciples. For a cultivator to be forced to behave like a common servant instead of undergoing closed-door cultivation, taking turns watching the door and pouring tea, it truly was highly regretful. Thinking about it now, if he hadn't used a Foundation establishment pill to buy out Elder Yi, perhaps his circumstances would not be much better than this person. He would similarly be required to bow and serve them cups of tea. Perhaps he would be even more restricted. Just as Han Li was sitting in the room, tasting the fragrant tea as many thoughts raced in his heart, Sect Master Zhang returned after a brief period. When he heard from his manservant disciple that a young Foundation establishment cultivator was looking for him, he couldn't help but feel astonished. This was because he could not remember this person based on the description given to him by manservant disciple. Out of the hundreds of Foundation establishment disciples, he had not found a person similar to this. 25 or 26 years old with somewhat dark skin and a plain appearance. Who could this be? Zhang Lingdao was 30% surprised and 20% curious, so he hurriedly walked towards the guest lobby where Han Li was at. When he entered the room, he saw a youth with an average appearance wearing a yellow Maple Valley uniform, gazing at a flowery painting on a wall with his back towards the sect master. He was currently staring at it with great interest. However, apparently the movement sect master Zhang made when he entered the room had been heard by the other person. Thus, this person immediately turned around and greeted him with a bow. "Senior Martial Brother Sect Master, Junior Martial Brother Han Li has come to see Sect Master." Han Li. When Sect Master Zhang heard this name, he felt that it was somewhat familiar, as if he had heard it before. But when he carefully looked at the other person, apart from having a somewhat familiar face, he did not remember exactly who this person was. This caused him to feel somewhat ashamed in his heart, and a trace of awkwardness was revealed on his face. Han Junior Marshal Brother Han, please sit. No need to be polite. Senior Marshal Brother, as the sect master, has been busy with business and arrived a little late. Junior Marshal Brother, please don't take offense. Zhang Lingdao was a sly old fox who had seen many big winds and waves. With a few careless, ambiguous sentences, he had easily dissolved the awkward mood that he created by not recognizing the other individual. TL, winds and waves, a lot of hard experiences. Han Li was not actually shocked that sect master Zhang could not recognize him. One had to know that the last time Han Li had seen this person was 5 years ago. At that time, he was only a low-quality and low-aptitude qi condensation disciple. Thus, sect master Zhang naturally would not put him in his heart, let alone have any kind of deep impression of him. If the other person was actually able to recognize him on sight, Han Li would feel greatly shocked. Chapter 219 Discussions. Chapter 219 Discussions. Senior Marshal Brother Sect Master, Junior Marshal Brother was able to cultivate to Foundation establishment by a fluke, thus he has come to Sect Master to inform him of this matter. I hope Sect Master could award me the privilege of establishing an Immortals cave. Han Li was not long-winded, directly stating his purpose in coming. You've just cultivated to Foundation establishment. Zhang Lingdao first stared blankly before soon coming to realization. To receive a Foundation establishment pill, then waiting until the most opportune moment before consuming and succeeding in Foundation establishment, was not a rare matter. This sect master Zhang considered Han Li to be one of those cases. Congratulations to Junior Marshal Brother Han on entering Foundation establishment. The sect's high-level disciples has increased by 1. This is truly a matter worth celebrating, Zhang Lingdao said with a faint smile as he twirled his long whiskers. This one was only lucky. This was thanks to the Foundation establishment pill bestowed by the sect, Han Li replied, gleaming with radiance. After Zhang Lingdao heard Han Li's courteous words, he carefully sized up Han Li. At this moment, he felt Han Li was becoming more and more familiar. He must have seen him before, but after a moment of thought, he could not remember when or where. As such, Zhang Lingdao could not help but nod his head and mutter to himself, bitterly entering deep thought. As Han Li saw this, he found this very funny and did not bother him. Minding his own business, he raised the teacup and slowly tasted the tea within. After a short moment, with a flash of realization, Zhang Lingdao actually thought of the matter of the rite of immortal ascension. He could not help but connect the youngster who originally stood in the main hall to the calm Junior Marshal Brother before him. Zhang Lingdao, having recalled Han Li's circumstances, could not help but sharply raise his head. He cried out with a face full of surprise. It's you, the disciple who entered the sect with the rite of immortal ascension. You actually succeeded in Foundation establishment. Senior Marshal Brother Sect Master actually remembers me. My matter of being able to enter the sect was truly thanks to Sect Master's assistance. When Han Li saw that the Sect Master had remembered him, he did not panic and instead lightly smiled toward Zhang Lingdao, expressing his thanks. Having heard the words Senior Marshal Brother Sect Master, Zhang Lingdao realized this was no longer the rogue cultivator who originally entered the sect but a Foundation establishment cultivator such as himself. Thus, after a brief expression of astonishment, he resumed his calm expression and mildly remarked, "It was nothing. This sect master has handled affairs in accordance to the rules for many years." However, Junior Marshal Brother Han was actually able to cultivation to Foundation establishment with false spiritual roots. It is inconceivable. If this were to spread, Junior Marshal Brother would be immediately known throughout the cultivation world. Although Zhang Qingdao's external appearance seemed to have returned to normal, his words revealed the astonishment in his heart. This was no surprise, as Sect Master Zhang clearly understood Han Li's original circumstances. A person with 4 attribute spiritual roots being able to attain Foundation establishment was truly hard for him to accept. Han Li saw this and smiled. With a half-joking tone, he said, "This one did not expect when he took the Foundation establishment pill, he would actually reach Foundation establishment. The only explanation is that I was assisted by the heavens, which saw a fool like me and gave me outrageous luck." When Han Li said this, he actually made the other party laugh. "But Junior Marshal Brother Han, wasn't your Foundation establishment pill given to Junior Marshal Disciple Yi's grandnephew? How did you obtain another Foundation establishment pill?" Right after Sect Master Zhang chuckled, he had second thoughts on something he didn't understand and asked. Senior Marshal Brother Sect Master, Didn't you give me a foundation establishment pill? Laughing in his herd, Han Li responded to this with chuckle. Me? Zhang Lingdao responded, puzzled. How could he possibly not have any memory of this? Could it be that sect master has already forgotten? Among the several people who returned alive from the forbidden area, there were 3 who were awarded a foundation establishment pill. I was one of those people, Han Li eventually said after putting away his smile. You are the in-name disciple accepted by martial ancestor Li. Zhang Lingdao grew excited, longer able to keep his calm appearance. That's right, I am the disciple that Master Li Huayuan accepted on the trip from the forbidden area. Han Li did not deny, directly acknowledging this. So it was like that. So that was why the name Han Li sounded so familiar. So it turned out that 2 years ago, the name of the disciple that everyone was bubbling about belonged to junior martial brother. Zhang Lingdao's eyes expressed even more astonishment as he spoke with a slightly more genial tone. Zhang Lingdao's intentions were clear. Since Han Li had already reached foundation establishment, becoming martial ancestor Li's official disciple was practically already determined. He naturally did not want to arouse any contempt from Han Li. He inwardly thought to himself, since it was like this junior martial brother Han must have reached foundation establishment by a complete fluke. Otherwise, with his aptitude, foundation establishment absolutely wouldn't be possible even out of 100 times. Although Zhang Lingdao truly felt uneasy, he naturally spoke to Han Li with a few courteous words. Then he had Han Li wait a short moment before going to fetch a register. Han Li naturally agreed and waited for his return. After the time it took to make a cup of tea, Zhang Lingdao walked out with a white jade slip. Then in front of Han Li, he used a golden brush to write Han Li's name at the very bottom of the densely written list of names. He was finally put into the record. When Han Li saw this, he grew delighted. He knew that he could now properly have his own immortals cave. Zhang Lingdao regularly conducted various matters for new foundation establishment disciples. When he saw Han Li's smiling face, he could somewhat guess what Han Li was thinking. Thus, after a faint smile, he took out 3 mid-grade spirit stones and 5 small and thin flags that were shrouded in white mist, handing them over to Han Li. What is this? Han Li could somewhat understand being given mid-grade spirit stones. This was the award for the sect's foundation establishment disciples, but whatever were these 5 palm-sized flags, there seemed to have spiritual chi and felt strange to the touch. It seemed as if they weren't ordinary magic tools. How strange. Without waiting for Han Li to ask, Zhang Lingdao held out his hand, handing over a jade slip to Han Li. He then explained, these spirit stones are a one-time reward that is given to all new foundation establishment disciples. Every year from now on, you will receive a mid-grade spirit stone without having to do any menial labor. As for these several trace bewildering flags, they are an essential item for establishing your immortals cave. Although they are used to arrange a trace bewildering magic formation, it is the most simple of small-scale formation spells. However, it is enough to prevent mortal people and animals from trespassing. Naturally, if junior martial brother is proficient in formation spells, he will not need to use these small flags. Furthermore, the jade slip contains formation establishing arts and controlling techniques. Naturally, a few other matters a foundation establishment disciple should be aware of are included within. After junior martial brother leaves, please take a look at them. Thank you for your trouble, senior martial brother sect master. Han Li accepted the jade slip with both hands and expressed his thanks continuously. These items were what Han Li currently required the most, hence he was unable to contain his joy. After these matters were finished, Han Li chatted with sect master Zhang for the time it took an incense stick to burn before taking his leave and departing from the main hall. After departing the stone hall, Han Li thought to fly out of Yellow Maple Valley and look for a place to establish his immortals cave. On his way, however, he looked through the jade slip that Zhang Lingdao had given him and immediately changed his mind. He then turned his flying magic tool to a different area. Kilin Pavilion, a rather grand and resounding name. It was one of Yellow Maple Valley's most important locations. That was because it was the sect's specialized area for raising and taming spirit beasts. Spirit beasts were actually demonic beasts. After these demonic beasts were tamed by cultivators, they would naturally be called spirit beasts. This Kilin Pavilion spirit beasts were mostly of grade 1. Although there were a few individual grade 2 spirit beasts, they were left there by others and could not be ordered at will. However, although there were only grade 1 spirit beasts, they provided numerous convenient services to the sect's many disciples. For example, transporting people, guarding households, seeking spiritual medicines, aiding in attacking enemies, and so on. Han Li had charged over there asking for a spirit beast by the name of Twin Pupil Mouse. It resembled a common mouse, but it had the innate divine eyes of a spirit beast. This was what Zhang Lingdao's Jade slip had recommended he use as an assistant for finding the optimal place to establish his Immortals cave. This intermediate grade 1 spirit beast's twin pupils were able to easily see through dense fog, rivers, trees, and other obstacles hindering a cultivator's line of sight. Furthermore, it was innately fond of burrowing its nest in areas with dense spiritual qi. With some slight training, this twin pupil mouse was an optimal scout for finding spirit eye areas. They were a favorite among the sect's disciples. This was not the first time Han Li came to Qilin Pavilion. He had previously come several times to handle affairs. He hurried past the front gates, not finding this place to be all that unfamiliar. He suddenly appeared from the sky, dropping at the base of a small jade-green mountain belonging to the Qilin Pavilion, the wondrous Beast Mountain's guest welcoming station. A low-level female cultivator immediately walked out to greet Han Li. "Martial uncle, are you here to rent a spirit beast?" These words were sharp and clear. This 16 to 17-year-old female disciple could not help but look at Han Li with an expectant expression. Han Li saw this and faintly smiled, saying, "Right now, are there any twin pupil mice available? I wish to rent one for 2 days." "Yes, of course we do. I will go bring one for martial uncle." When the female disciple heard this, she smiled and happily replied. Chapter 220, Spirit Well Spring. Chapter 220, Spirit Well Spring. After the female disciple went to retrieve the spirit beast, Han Li quietly waited at the welcoming station, occasionally glancing at the spell restrictions surrounding him. Apart from the mountaintop that Han Li was at, the other areas on the Spirit Beast Mountain were all contained by individual multicolored restrictive magic spells. These divided it up into differently sized resting places for spirit beasts. Every area sealed by the restrictive spells had a domestication place for one kind of spirit beast. Apart from the disciples on duty at the Qilin Pavilion, other people were not allowed to enter. This was because they were afraid that others would startle the spirit beasts, or that the beasts that were not yet domesticated would harm outsiders. Thus, although the entire Spirit Beast Mountain seemed to be very quiet and peaceful, in reality at least nearly 1,000 different spirit beasts lived there. The scale was not so surprising. That female disciple did not make Han Li wait for long. After the time it took to eat a meal, she walked out of some restricted area with a fist-sized small beast in her bosom, hurrying directly towards Han Li. "This is the twin pupil mouse. The price of renting it is 1 low-grade spirit stone every day," said the female disciple to Han Li respectfully, while using a hand to gently stroke the soft fur of the little beast. "Okay, here are 3 spirit stones. I will use it for 3 days," said Han Li indifferently to the female. After 3 days, Junior Martial Uncle only needs to release this twin pupil mouse, and it will return to the Qilin Pavilion by itself. During this period of time, I hope that Junior Martial Uncle will treat this beast well. This pouch contains its favorite earth pear fruit. Should Junior Martial Uncle find the time, he can feed it a few. The young woman received the spirit stones, then handed the spirit beast to Han Li and took out a small white pouch as she said to Han Li. Han Li nodded his head, then freely received it. Then, under the young woman's respectful gaze, he flew away on his flying magic tool. Han Li flew directly northwest. As Han Li hurried there, he couldn't help but size up the lovable twin pupil mouse in his bosom. At a glance, this yellow little beast really seems like a normal earth mouse. The two species both had similar body proportions, the same yellow fur and a slim, long tail. The only difference was that its face sported a pair of large eyes, very different from those of normal mice. Despite this being the only difference, however, it immediately caused this beast to become extremely cute. The fact that a trace of 5-colored light could be seen flashing across its eyes simply served to accentuate this beast's mystique. Even someone as indifferent as Han Li couldn't help but stroke it a few times when he saw this beast's cute appearance. The idea of whether or not he should also raise a twin pupil mouse emerged in his mind. However, Han Li was also clear that, despite this small beast's docile nature, it was nonetheless a genuine intermediate grade 1 demonic beast. Thinking to this point, Han Li fiddled with the beast's little ear one more time. After gazing at it shaking about amusingly for a while, he couldn't help but let out a laugh. It was as if the child that had been buried inside of his heart for so long had broken out once again. Han Li flew in this manner for a day straight before finally stopping at the most northwestern part of the Tai Yue mountain range. Another 50 kilometers north from this location, one would have entered the state of Yuan Wu. That place was the territory of the state of Yuan Wu's great sect, the Heavenly Star Sect. In addition, they had established a market city which rivaled that of the Yellow Maple Valley. 100 kilometers west was the smallest administrative district in the Jian province and state of Yuan Wu, the boundary of the Zai province. This province was also the only place where the seven great sects had not stationed a single garrison. This was because apart from incredibly tall, sandy slopes, the Zai province consisted of a boundless desert that took up greater than 3/4 of its area. The entire combined population of the province was only 100,000 people or so. Thus, it had no resources or people to use. Naturally, this place would not enter the eyes of the seven great sects. There were two reasons why Han Li chose to open up a cave near this place. The first reason was that this desolate location of the Tai Yue mountain range bordered the state of Yuan Wu on one side and was near the Zai province on another side. They were both locations where very few disciples from his sect would pass through. In this way, he wouldn't have anyone to disturb his cultivation. Second was that this was not far from the Heavenly Star Sect's market city. If he wanted to sell some medicinal ingredients or buy something, he could easily make exchanges here without worrying about being recognized by others. It was with this train of thought that Han Li picked a location where the spiritual qi was not the best, unlike the caves of other Foundation establishment disciples, which were all densely packed into locations where the spiritual qi was the densest. Upon descending, Han Li wrapped a slim rope that he had prepared beforehand around the twin pupil mouse's neck to prevent it from running too fast and thus keep him from losing the small thing. Then, he pulled out a yellow, round fruit from the small storage pouch and tossed it to the small beast, allowing it to gnaw on it. After a moment, the twin pupil beast became energized, having demolished the pair. After gently calling out "Su-Su" twice, it shot into a nearby patch of grass with a whiz, disappearing without a trace. Han Li leisurely followed the rope. Han Li stood on one side of the arduously steep mountaintop, gazing at the 300 or so feet tall mountain wall opposite him. He stared at the sight blankly. This was because the rope on his hand, passing through a narrow hole in the rock, directly extended into the mountain wall facing him. It was currently the afternoon of the second day. Having gone through 2 days of bitter searching, the twin pupil mouse suddenly began to frantically rush forwards the moment it drew near the mountain wall. After rushing Han Li to this location, it slipped into the mountain through the small crack. Han Li looked at the taut, thin rope in his hand, and his curiosity was greatly piqued. He thought for a moment, then instantly patted his storage pouch, and that huge silver sword appeared in Han Li's hands. Han Li grasped the rope tightly with one hand and swung the silver sword with the other. In an instant, as if he were cutting tofu, the narrow crack in front of him widened to a rough entrance that a person could crawl through. After crawling in head first, he immediately activated a protective barrier around his body. Then, he followed the string, cutting open the mountain rock with each step, slowly progressing. All of the falling pieces of rock and dust were blocked by his water attribute barrier, keeping his entire body neat and tidy. This kind of physical work continued for more than an hour, and a 30-foot-long simple, crude stone tunnel slowly formed. When Han Li hacked again with his sword, a sudden crash sounded, and the stone wall was finally broken open. Han Li was very happy when he saw this. He used enough effort to wildly stab a few times, causing the stone wall to be completely hacked open. Then he took a big stride out. A roughly 30-foot large naturally formed cave appeared before his eyes. Han Li had just entered this area when a gust of dense spiritual qi pounced forwards, causing him to feel greatly stunned. However, his gaze still followed the rope in his hand, only to see that the thin rope stretched all the way to the center of the cave. There was actually a miniature spring mouth that gurgled with spring water. The twin pupil mouse was actually lying in the middle of this water bed that was a few feet large, contentedly swimming around in it. This time, Han Li was truly shocked. This was because almost all of the dense spiritual qi in this cave came from this spring. He hurriedly walked over, scooped up a handful of spring water, and began to carefully examine it. This is a spirit well spring. There definitely can't be a mistake. Without expending too much effort, Han Li confirmed the guess in his heart. Even though the spiritual qi contained in the spring water is not as exaggerated as rumors suggest, and this spring mouth is very small, it truly is a rarely seen spirit well spring. Han Li muttered to himself in disbelief, his two hands sticking into the water. Then he closed his eyes, feeling the strands of spiritual qi being emitted from the water. The grin on his face couldn't help but grow wider. Speaking of spirit springs, one also had to mention spirit veins and spirit wells in the cultivating world. The spiritual qi in the world was not actually evenly distributed. Some places were denser in spiritual qi, while others were more sparse. Thus, after a long period of time, spirit veins of varying sizes would usually form in areas with dense spiritual qi. Large spirit veins could be tens of thousands of kilometers long, while small ones could be as small as a few kilometers, truly pitifully small. But regardless of size, when these spirit veins were formed, they would automatically release faint amounts of spiritual qi, causing the location's spiritual qi to circulate unceasingly. Resources in such areas would never dry up. But in locations with different spirit veins, the amounts of spiritual qi produced were not necessarily even either. Those locations with the densest accumulation of spiritual qi were naturally the most suitable for cultivators to meditate and cultivate at. Thus, they were called spirit wells by the cultivating world. The so-called spirit wells were generally invisible, and their existences could only be realized by a cultivator's spiritual sense. However, when a location was designated as a spirit well, it was the location in the spirit vein where spiritual qi was at its greatest. This was undoubtable. Although spirit wells were formless under normal circumstances, only acting as a substitute name for any given location, if a spirit well's spiritual qi was excessively dense and could be preserved for a long period of time, it would gradually produce a true physical form and become a spirit well object, such as a spirit well pearl, stone, fountain, or the like. There were even the legendary supreme spirit well trees. The appearance of a spirit well's physical manifestation was a very rarely seen occurrence. Not a single one hadn't experienced numerous tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of years, as well as a stroke of luck, before forming. Thus, the spiritual qi emitted by these true spirit well objects was much denser than that of common spirit wells. Meditating and cultivating near them would definitely have the profound effect of increasing one's rate of cultivation. The best spirit well objects could even increase one's cultivating speed by 20 or 30%. In addition, when these true objects were formed, even spirit well trees or fountains could all be moved away by a person's magic power without having its effectiveness diminished. Chapter 221, The Heavenly Star Sect and Spell Formations. Spirit well objects were quite miraculous. They would naturally be pursued by all cultivators who pursued the heavenly Tao to even the point of madness. Whenever a spirit well object appeared in the cultivation world, it would cause a storm of blood at that location. In the present cultivation world of the state of UA, the 7 great sects had already acquired a few spirit well objects, but if a small clan or sect were to acquire these treasures, they'd only be inviting a calamity upon themselves. Yellow Maple Valley had a spirit well stone, 3 spirit springs, and several other spirit well objects, all of which were bluntly distributed among the core formation experts and higher. Even the great sect master Zhang was unable to possess one. Naturally, the great nascent soul martial ancestor possessed a great number of them. And Li absolutely didn't expect with just a common twin-pupil mouse, he would have been able to find a nearby spirit well object so easily within the span of a day. Although this spirit spring was the lowest among spirit well objects, the spring's mouth was pathetically small, and its efficacy was probably limited. A spirit well object was still a spirit well object. At the very least, he would cultivate faster than those at common spirit well locations. So long as it sped up his cultivation even the slightest, it was still good. However, even though he was surprised and extremely happy, Han Li still felt a bit puzzled. Weren't spirit well objects only able to take shape within areas with the densest spiritual qi? The spiritual qi at this mountain peak wasn't particularly thick, so how was it able to form? Even so, since the heaven had dropped him such a great meat pie, Han Li would not let it go. Although a spirit well spring was able to be moved, only a core formation expert would have the means to do so. Anybody on a lower stage of cultivation would not yet have the ability to do so, let alone Han Li. Since he couldn't move it, he decided to establish his Immortals cave at this location. Thus he planned to make the Spirit Spring Cave into his own secret training room and keep it well concealed. Han Li immediately chopped open a passage and carried out an expansion. With one hand waving the silver sword and the other controlling several gold blades, Han Li undertook the great task of establishing his Immortals cave. Meanwhile, the twin pupil mouse had plunged itself into the spirit spring and was unwilling to come out. The sounds of its snores could be heard afterwards. Relying on the silver sword's sharpness and the quantity of golden blades, Han Li labored for half a day, creating a somewhat large premature layout for his immortal's cave. He carved out 13 rooms of various sizes and 3 halls a sixth of an acre large. Although the cave walls of his rooms were still very coarse, not having undergone any meticulous work, at the very least it could be considered a home. This caused Han Li to let out a breath and relax. He now suddenly recalled the twin pupil mouse and hastily took advantage of this moment to return to the spirit spring. He picked up the still sleeping small mouse by the nape and flew off a few hundred kilometers before dropping it off, letting it return to Qilin Pavilion by itself. For the time being, Han Li's immortal's cave had only one exit. That was why after he returned, he immediately took out several tens of low-grade spirit stones and the 5 small flags, setting up the small-scale trace bewildering formation in accordance to the Jade slip, and completely concealing the exit with a formation spell. Thus, if someone were to look from the outside, they would see an intact mountain wall. They would essentially be unable to see the cave opening. After finishing the most basic defenses, Han Li used the silver sword to carve out a simple stone bed. Then he hurriedly lied down, falling asleep. He was truly tired. For the next several days, Han Li was busy without end. He found an area of flat earth near his concealed immortal's cave and planted a few spiritual medicine seeds. Among these seeds were a few common medicine seeds from the mortal world, as well as rare seeds he had gathered from 100 Medicine Garden after spending several years there. This place was on the verge of becoming Han Li's personal medicine garden, where future spiritual medicine seedlings would sprout and flower. In the time he had left over, Han Li looked for few solid slabs of bluestones on the mountain, cutting them off and sculpting them into stone tables, desks, and other tools. He then placed a set in each of the rooms. Finally, he meticulously cut smooth the walls and embedded them with a few moonlight stones, causing the inside of the cave to be as bright as day. Han Li's immortal's cave was finally established. Even so, it was clear that the defenses of this immortal's cave could easily be destroyed with a single blow. It was truly incapable of allowing Han Li to cultivate with an easy heart. According to his thoughts, he would need a similar comprehensive restriction spell as the one protecting 100 Medicine Garden, at the very least. Otherwise, if an enemy were to invade as he was cultivating, the consequences would be more than terrible. Han Li was an amateur at formation spells. He fundamentally couldn't arrange even the most basic of formation spells, let alone the more difficult restriction spells. However, he also didn't plan on learning. It should be known that the Tao of formation spells were as vast as the sea. If he were to learn it half-heartedly, he wouldn't have any small success even with 10 or 20 years. He absolutely couldn't let it interfere with his cultivation in the slightest, since any wasted time was an intolerable loss. This world may have a genius that could gain profound insight into formation spells without hindering their cultivation rate, even to the point where such a monstrous cultivation genius could manipulate the Tao of formation spells. But Han Li clearly knew that he absolutely wasn't such a person. For him, if he were even the least bit distracted in that field, then even his slightest hopes of entering core formation would be obliterated forever. But fortunately, this world still had formation flags, formation plates, and other magic tools capable of easily putting down a formation. Although by using such, one generally wouldn't be able to put down ferocious, large-scale formation spells, Han Li currently only wanted a standard formation spell to defend his immortal's cave so he that could feel mostly at ease. Besides, if it truly wasn't possible, he would just set several enshrouding formation spells instead. He would make up for the deficiency in defense through quantity. Han Li planned to go to the Heavenly Star Sect's market city. They were certain to have restrictive-type magic tools there. Thus in the days ahead, after Han Li's several medicinal plants budded, he immediately used the green liquid to expedite their maturation. He planned to use 1,000-year-old medicine ingredients to exchange for the necessary items at the Heavenly Star Sect's market city. This time, he would only reveal 1,000-year-old herb to avoid having others provoke or suspect him, thereby preventing unnecessary troubles. After a short 2 months, Han Li matured his medicinal herb by 1,000 years. Then he flew northward with the medicine herb along with some other items he wished to exchange, such as the materials from the inky flood dragon, the hard shell of the centipede, as well as other rare materials. If the price was suitable, be it spirit stones or magic tools, he wouldn't mind exchanging them. In any case, he also wouldn't half-heartedly learn how to refine magic tools. As Han Li flew, he wore a cloak to guard against anything unexpected. With Han Li's greatly increased magic power, he was able to cover over 50 kilometers in less than half a day. Entering the state of Yuan Wu, Han Li looked from east to west from up above. He did this not only to look for the Heavenly Star Sect's market city, but also because he felt rather curious about the state of Yuan Wu. But after looking at the scenery, it didn't seem any different from the state of Yue. The state of Yuan Wu and the state of Yue were similar. They were both medium-sized nations nearby one another. Although these two nations were only a third of the size of the great states of Tianluo and Fengdu, they were still much larger than the small nearby states of Jiang and Chaoyun. TL, Chinese letter state of Tianluo can mean heaven gathering. Chinese letter state of Fengdu can mean wind capital. Jiang and Chaoyun are just names. Although these two were the largest nations in the area, they were surrounded by 10 other minor nations. As for the smallest nations, there were several tens of those nearby that were densely scattered. Furthermore, rumors had it that in a land far away, there existed a great supreme nation that was large beyond belief. In the cultivation world of Yuan Wu, the righteous and demonic sects were equal in strength and were in a state of deadlock. The Heavenly Star Sect was one of the core figures of the righteous sects, possessing no less strength than Yellow Maple Valley. TL, reminder, most states are in a war between righteousness and evil. The state of Yue was taken over by neutral powers. While Han Li was thinking about the matters of the Heavenly Star Sect, the leaf magic tool below his feet suddenly sunk, slowly descending to the earth as if it suddenly lost its flight ability. Seeing these unfavorable circumstances, Han Li not only felt no fear, but he also felt a sliver of happiness. It seemed he had already arrived near the Heavenly Star Sect's market city. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a restriction spell prohibiting flight. Descended onto the ground, Han Li walked north about 4 kilometers before coming across a group of buildings somewhat bigger than Yellow Maple Valley's market city. The Heavenly Star Sect's market city was very strange, and it differed completely from Yellow Maple Valley's market city. At its center, there was a huge pavilion about 100 meters tall. Scattered around it were several buildings only a tenth of its size, causing the city to emit an appearance of order throughout. Because the sign attached to the center pavilion was truly too large, Han Li was able to clearly make it out from a kilometer away as Stardust Pavilion. It seemed there was no need to ask whether this was the personal shop of the Heavenly Star Sect. In the blink of an eye, Han Li tread the kilometer. In accordance to habit, Han Li did not move impulsively. Instead, he circled the outer layer of the market city, slowly strolling through once and uncovering the circumstances of the market city. Needless to say, there were many stores here that widened Han Li's perspective and made him grow eager. There was a tool refinement room that would accept a cultivator's materials at any time and refine them into magic tools at the owner's request. Furthermore, the store's signboards were not humble. They actually professed they were capable of refining even top-grade magic tools. Furthermore, if refinement failed, then they would return the value of the materials twofold in the form of spirit stones. Naturally, if one didn't have materials, they would still be able to order a magic tool, but the price was guaranteed to be far from inexpensive. There was a different store refining talismans. Its details were nearly similar to that of the tool refining store, and it similarly made custom talismans. The others were slightly different. There was a Spirit Beast Institute, specialized in the sale of all kinds of trained demonic beasts. They even had a few advanced grade 1 demonic beasts. If he were to purchase one as a Spirit Beast Guard, it wouldn't be such a bad idea. Chapter 222, Tool Refining Expert. Han Li only saw 20 or 30 cultivators in the outer areas. There didn't seem to be many people in the desolate market. Could everyone have gone to the Stardust Pavilion in the center? Han Li started to mutter somewhat in his heart. However, he did not intend to immediately head over to the Stardust Pavilion. That was because that tool refining store's claim was too arrogant. If the talisman refining store failed, then they would return the materials equivalent twofold in spirit stones. This piqued his curiosity. Thus, when Han Li finished circling around it, he couldn't help but walk inside. The storefront could not be considered to be large, consisting of only 3 rooms and an outer courtyard. When Han Li entered the foremost hall, he saw a middle-aged figure dressed like a Confucian scholar in the midst of a discussion with a white-haired yet red-faced elder. A muscular man with dark skin stood to the side with a respectful expression. The middle-aged man and the elder were currently fixated on their discussion. Although they saw Han Li enter, they indifferently continued their conversation. It was the strong man who did his duty and walked forwards a few steps, then asked very politely, "Does this guest want to buy magic tools or place an order to have one made?" "Let me first take a look at the magic tools in your store before deciding whether or not I want to place an order," Han Li replied evenly. "Very well. Does this guest want to look at mid-grade or high-grade magic tools?" The muscular man asked happily, seeing that business had actually come to their door. "Top-grade magic tools. In addition, I want the finest ones amongst all the top-grade magic tools." Han Li was not loud, but this sentence immediately shocked the muscular man into a daze. The two people who were talking up a frenzy immediately shut their mouths and stopped talking, instead blankly staring and sizing up Han Li. This guest wants to see top-grade magic tools and even wants the finest ones. After regaining his senses, the muscular man couldn't help but confirm whether or not he had heard correctly. Top-grade magic tools were not something that any ordinary person could buy, frequently costing hundreds of low-grade spirit stones. Average cultivators, even if they saved up spirit stones for their entire lives, might not even be able to buy one, while Han Li had asked to see the best top-grade items right off the bat. Naturally, this explained why the muscular man had lost his self-control for a moment. "Little Black, come back. You cannot be disrespectful to this senior." That white-haired elder finally recognized Han Li's identity as a Foundation establishment cultivator. His expression couldn't help but change, and he hurriedly commanded the muscular man to retreat. "This little elder is the owner of this store. If senior has any business, just say so." This elder and that Confucian scholar were still qi condensation cultivators. For an expert like Han Li to come into a small shop like his, he couldn't help but feel somewhat unsettled. "There's not much. It depends on whether or not your place has any good magic tools. If you have any ones that are suitable, I will buy one or two." The elder instantly let out a sign after hearing these words from Han Li, but he still spoke somewhat awkwardly. "Unfortunately, we can only disappoint senior. Although my shop does have 2 or 3 top-grade magic tools, they are only used to promote this store. They are not actually so extraordinary." The elder, when faced with a Foundation establishment cultivator like Han Li, did not dare to conceal anything, and so he could only say the truth. Upon hearing this, Han Li felt quite disappointed. However, he also couldn't help but silently berate himself for his stupidity. Even if the sign hung outside of the store were to be even more exaggerated, it was still only a method for them to attract business. He had actually treated it as if it were true. Han Li shook his head and turned around, about to leave. However, when he neared the door, he still turned his head around and spoke somewhat unhappily. "So you're saying that the claim that you have the ability to refine top-grade magic tools is also just empty words?" "No, senior is mistaken. This small shop does business with integrity. The sign outside is completely true with no falsehoods. As long as you have the appropriate materials, Elder Su can really refine a top-grade magic tool," the white-haired elder hurriedly replied, seeing that the shop's reputation had been involved. "You can refine top-grade magic tools?" Han Li felt very surprised, and a look of doubt flashed across his eyes. His words were filled with questions. He had thought that there was someone else who could refine the magic tools. He hadn't expected it to be this elderly person. No wonder Han Li didn't believe it. Refining top-grade magic tools was not like refining mid- or high-grade magic tools, which could be refined by common fire. Instead, similar to refining a Foundation establishment pill, it required tempering by earth fire or innate true fire to successfully refine it. But this elder was only a qi condensation cultivator and would not possess innate true fire, while this location did not seem like a place with earth fire. So how could this person refine a top-grade magic tool? This is the first time senior has come to this elder brother's shop, so it's very normal to not understand this. The origins of elder brother Su's Tao of tool refinement originates from his clan, and his talent in refining tools is definitely not below that of tool refining masters from other great sects. In addition, for the past few hundred years, the Su clan had taken care of an elementary grade 2 fire raven. The demonic fire it spits out is even somewhat stronger than innate true fire, so it's more than enough to refine top-grade magic tools. The middle-aged Confucian scholar that had been sitting silently on the side suddenly opened his mouth and explained on behalf of the elder. However, This only increased Han Li's doubts. Demonic fire. I've only heard of using true fire and earth fire to refine pills or tools. I've never heard that it was also possible with demonic fire. Han Li expressed slight disbelief with knitted eyebrows. There are things that Senior does not know. Using demonic fire to refine tools or even pills requires a few special skills that are not officially recognized by the great sects. It has been thought of as a minor, unorthodox technique and is not very widespread. If our clan hadn't haphazardly obtained this fire raven, we also would not take the time to research this path. The elder continued the Confucian scholar's words and addressed some of Han Li's doubts. So it's like that. Although Han Li had heard the other person's description, he still had not seen it personally, and so he was still somewhat apprehensive. Does Senior also want to order a custom top-grade magic tool? Asked the elder with curiosity, seeing that the other person had lowered their head to ponder over something. If I give you enough materials to refine a top-grade magic tool, how much certainty do you have? Han Li raised his head and asked noncommittally. This depends on the quality of the materials as well as the requirements Senior has towards the magic tool. If the materials are average and the requirements for the magic tool are also average, I have a 1/3 chance of succeeding. However, if the refinement of the top-grade magic tool fails, the store will not refund the materials because the rates of failure are too high. The twofold compensation is only with regards to mid and high-grade magic tools. Otherwise, perhaps this little elder would have already compensated himself to death. Upon hearing Han Li ask this, the little elder was secretly happy in his heart, and he immediately and respectfully replied. One had to know that what tool refinement experts like him lacked the most was high-quality materials to refine with. The process of refining a few top-grade magic tools would greatly increase his tool refining skill. In addition, although the individual in front of him did not sound old, he was already a foundation establishment cultivator. The materials he could bring out would definitely not be normal. This caused him to look forward to it very much. I do have some materials and I can let you try to refine them once. However, while you are refining the magic tool, I must be watching from the side. You can rest assured knowing that I will definitely not disturb you, and as long as the refinement is a success, I will give the leftover ingredients to you as a reward. I won't let you work in vain. Han Li made up his mind and said the aforementioned words after a moment of silence. To Han Li, exchanging those precious inky flood dragon materials for spirit stones was not as beneficial as directly refining them into a useful magic tool. One had to know that although the number of top-grade magic tools he had currently was high among Qi condensation disciples, he was unclear about it when compared to foundation establishment cultivators. However, he guessed that other people definitely would not have too few either. Excellent. Does Senior want to refine it right now? This little elder can begin at any time. The elder cried out with anticipation, seeing that Han Li really wanted to let him refine a top-grade magic tool. He immediately became excited and agreed to Han Li's conditions. There are still some things I need to buy. When I finish my business, I will come back and we can begin. Han Li shook his head and added after hearing this. Okay then, in that case Junior will wait for Senior. The elder, seeing that Han Li did not seem to want to let him begin his work immediately, couldn't help but feel somewhat disappointed, but immediately afterwards he recovered his state of mind. The elder said this respectfully. Knowing that everything had been arranged, Han Li did not want to stay here any longer. After casually saying goodbye, he turned around and walked out of the store. But before he had even walked a few tens of feet away from the store, the voice of the Confucian student suddenly came from behind him. Senior, please stop for a moment. Han Li's figure paused. After hesitating for a moment, he stopped moving. Then, he turned around and saw the Confucian scholar chasing behind him. At this time, he was looking at Han Li with a face full of smiles. Is there something you need? Han Li knitted his eyebrows and asked coldly. He did not really like people who disturbed him for no reason. This junior wanted to ask Senior if you came to this market intending to buy something. This junior's name is Wang Xiling, and I am often around this market. Perhaps my help can save Senior a significant amount of time. Hearing this, Han Li sized up the Confucian student with some confusion. Suddenly, he lightly smiled and asked, "Are you a frequent hire?" Although the Confucian scholar couldn't see Han Li's expression clearly due to the cloak, he could clearly hear the laughter in Han Li's voice, and his heart loosened up. He immediately replied, "Senior guessed correctly. This junior occasionally spends his time there. I'm not exclusively hired by that one store, so Senior can feel free to relax." Han Li somewhat carelessly nodded his head, but he indifferently said, "Although I don't mind whether or not you are specifically hired by the store, this time I want to buy a few formation flags and formation plates. It seems like the best decision is to go to the Stardust Pavilion. I don't think that I need any help." Chapter 223, Secret Store Auction. When the Confucian scholar heard Han Li's words, he stared blankly for a moment before immediately smiling. Then he joyfully said, "Senior, it is fortunate that you've told me this, else you would have gone on a trip in vain. Although the fame of the Heavenly Star Sect's formation spells is quite renowned, this does not apply to the Stardust Pavilion's top formation flags and formation plates. Although there are many and various formation flags and formation plates inside the Stardust Pavilion, they are only common rubbish sold to small cultivator clans and rogue cultivators. Formation spell tools of true quality are not released by the Heavenly Star Sect. This is because if their finest spell formation items were released to outsiders, the gaps in their formation could be seen through. As they say, the gains do not make up for the losses." As the Confucian scholar was explaining off to the side, he stole a look at Han Li. However, the hood of Han Li's cloak prevented his face from being seen, and so the scholar couldn't make out the slightest of emotion, much to his great frustration. "From your tone, it sounds as if you know where I can find the items I want." Although Han Li was greatly surprised from the Confucian scholar's words, he still maintained his flat, calm tone, completely hiding his inner shock. When the Confucian scholar heard this, he first looked left and right several times. After there was no one around, he secretly whispered, "If Senior believes this Junior, he can introduce you to a secret store that very few know about. Although that location has a small issue about its past history, all of its goods are high quality and rarely seen. I believe that Senior will certainly be able to find satisfactory formation spell tools there." Secret store. Although Han Li's voice was still low, he was actually inwardly startled by the Confucian scholar's words. In the past several years, Han Li had heard rumors of a secret store once or twice. Han Li knew that if the Confucian scholar spoke truthfully, this would be a truly rare chance to broaden his horizons. "It seems that Senior also know a bit about the secret store. This is great. In that case, there's no need for Junior to waste time explaining. There are probably still 4 to 6 hours left before the secret store's monthly auction. If Senior wishes to go, please decide soon. I will be able to immediately show you the way." When the Confucian scholar saw Han Li display no disgust upon the mention of the secret store, he could not help but secretly rejoice. He knew that chasing after this client was most likely the correct course of action for him to take. "It isn't too far?" Han Li suddenly asked. "It isn't far. The secret store is within the market city. Does Senior approve?" The Confucian scholar grew a bit excited. By giving the secret store a potential customer, he was able to reap a significant percentage in spirit stones. "Let's go." After he let out a relaxed breath, Han Li's tone was no longer cold. "This one will lead the way." The Confucian scholar had a happy expression and took the initiative to lead. After the Confucian scholar turned 7 corners, he brought Han Li in front of a small lodge. The door was secured, and there was no sign on the door. It seemed very unremarkable. The Confucian scholar lightly knocked on the door with a certain response. The door opened. A woman about 30 years old walked out. This woman's looks were average, and her cultivation was only at the 6th or 7th layer of qi condensation, truly unremarkable. "Lady Zhang, this one brings a new customer. He also wishes to participate in the auction." Wang Xiling did not wait for the woman to speak and hastily introduced Han Li with great energy. After Lady Zhang heard Wang Xiling say he brought a customer, she did not show an expression of joy but scowled instead, as if she wasn't in agreement. But after she took a clear look and saw that this customer was a Foundation Establishment cultivator, her expression changed to a slight smile. "This time, you've brought a proper customer rather than the trash you previously brought. A Foundation Establishment Senior. Senior, please come in." Although this woman's cultivation was very low, she didn't look at Han Li with any reverence. Instead, she seemed to consider Han Li an ordinary customer. "Senior, this one can only bring you to this location. He will first take his leave." Wang Xiling blushed from the woman's words and hurried to say his farewell to Han Li. After seeing the Confucian scholar's figure disappear into the distance, the woman stepped to the side, signaling Han Li to enter. After he entered, he saw that all sorts of shoddy materials for pill and tool refinement were arranged out for display like an ordinary raw materials shop. Han Li carefully observed the woman, who closed the door and then respectfully said, "Please follow me, sir." With that said, the woman took a few steps to the corner of the room. She then pressed her hand against the ground. Yellow light flashed from her hand, when all of a sudden a large hole opened from the ground. The woman called out to Han Li, indicating that he was to follow her lead. After a moment of slight hesitation, Han Li walked into the tunnel and cautiously followed. However, the ever-cautious Han Li naturally stayed on guard. The tunnel was very short. After about 30 meters, there was a somewhat small stone door. Two black-clothed men stood in front of either side of the door, each wearing a devil's mask. After Han Li took a look at the two black-clothed men, his expression immediately grew heavy. They were actually Foundation establishment cultivators like him. Furthermore, one of them was mid-stage Foundation establishment. Han Li could not help but be wary of this store's strength. The woman pushed through the stone door as if she hadn't seen the black-clothed men and brought Han Li inside. The two black-clothed men also turned a blind eye, neither speaking nor obstructing them. After Han Li entered the room, he grew distracted. A large, majestic hall appeared before his eyes. Vermilion fur rugs, snow-white jade walls, palace lanterns hanging from the ceiling. All of this gave off an appearance of the greatest wealth from the mortal world. It seemed the owner of this room was quite wondrous. The large hall was shaped as an oval with a diameter of about 100 meters. 7 or 8 lines of chairs were arranged in the hall with several tens of uniquely dressed cultivators seated upon them. Across from them was a lone, empty table, not far from which were 3 sandalwood chairs. Seeing Han Li and the woman enter, the people sitting could not help but look in their direction. After those gazes swept past Han Li, he felt his body quiver with a cold sweat. His expression greatly changed. More than half of those people were cultivators in late-stage Foundation establishment. At this moment, Han Li realized why the woman at his side did not show any semblance of reverence toward him. At this place, he was but a common sight. "Your esteemed self has come at a good time. The auction was about to start. This small woman will no longer accompany you. I must return upward to take care of a few matters." Han Li helplessly looked at the several cultivators in the hall, and silently looked for a remote corner before sitting down. At this moment, he already noticed that the cultivators here were concealing their faces like him, using cloaks to hide their true features. It seemed no one was so stupid enough to let others discover their identity. Although the people in the hall weren't few in number, no one was speaking. The incomparable silence caused the air to carry a trace of tension. When Han Li saw this, he also remained extremely well behaved. Aside from some malicious guesses of any acquaintances he would recognize here, he wholeheartedly paid attention to the wooden door directly behind the long table. It seemed that the owner should be preparing behind that door. After Han Li sat there for 5 to 6 hours, the wooden door behind the table finally opened. 3 people walked out one by one. From their appearance, they seemed identical to the guards at the stone door. It was unable to see who was master and servant. At this moment, they stood behind the long table. The person standing on the right first spoke with a low and hoarse voice. "Welcome to our trade fair, fellow Taoists of the cultivation world. Among our current customers, there are old and regular customers as well as newcomers. But this does not matter, as this store treats everyone equally." When the person on the right finished, the person on the left immediately started talking. "This trade fair is completely fair. When someone shouts out a price in spirit stones, everyone must use spirit stones to compete. If someone doesn't have sufficient spirit stones, they will be able to use an item of equivalent value as collateral. As for its specific worth, all 3 of us will jointly evaluate it. In short, the highest price will acquire the item on sale." This person's voice was completely different. It was shrill and quiet, very much falsetto, causing those who heard it to feel at great unease. Finally, after all the items in the store have been sold, everyone is free to conduct business during this time. If there are any items you wish to sell or exchange, you will be able to step forward and present them at will and trade them independently. We will not meddle in the slightest and will only offer the place to conduct business. All right, everything has been said. Let the trade fair begin. The middle person's voice was actually simple and loud, resonating throughout the room. Following these words, the 3 flashed to the side, appearing on the sandalwood seats behind the table. At this moment, a very tall and thin middle-aged man with a shrewd appearance walked out from the wooden door. This man walked to the table and coughed several times before declaring, "This auction will be directed by me. The first item for auction will be the top-grade magic tool, Fire Cloud Sword. This item. Chapter 224, Mechanical Puppet Beasts. Chapter 224, Mechanical Puppet Beasts. The first item being auctioned was a rather powerful top-grade magic tool, causing Han Li to feel somewhat surprised. This was especially because this articulate, tall, thin figure had colorfully and dynamically described the magic tool as unparalleled and hard to find on the earth. Even Han Li, when he heard it, had a slight impulse of pulling out his spirit stones to buy it, not to mention other cultivators who desperately lacked top-grade magic tools. As expected, the base price of 200 spirit stones had just been revealed when 3 or 4 impatient individuals immediately called out bids. In the blink of an eye, this fire cloud sword's price had been raised to more than 300 spirit stones, causing the other cultivators, who had originally also wanted to call out a price, to immediately extinguish this train of thought. Although the fire cloud attacks of the fire cloud sword weren't too bad, it was obviously one step inferior to a top-grade magic tool of true quality. Spending 300 spirit stones for it seemed to be somewhat in poor taste. However, even if there were people unwilling to buy it, naturally there were others willing to be taken advantage of. To the people who were willing to buy it, although the items that would be auctioned off later would be finer in quality, there was no way for them to obtain it. It was better and more realistic for them to buy the decent top-grade magic tool in front of them. Thus, this fire cloud sword reached a price of 400 spirit stones due to the contentions between a few chi condensation cultivators. It was sold off relatively successfully. The cultivator wearing a doll mask happily returned to his seat after turning in his spirit stones, holding the sword in his hands. It seemed like he was going to take it home and make it his family heirloom. This caused other cultivators to think that it was somewhat humorous. The tall and skinny figure waited for the person to return to his seat, then cleared his throat and said, "The second item this store will auction is naturally a tool refinement master's greatest love, a top-grade red sky gathering furnace. This furnace has been passed down through the hands of many great tool refinement masters. It is an exquisite item that has refined many top-grade items, such as the Phantom Sound Sword, Azure Flood Dragon Banner, Black Flame Pearl, and many others. From hearsay, this furnace has the ability to grant additional properties when refining tools. However, as for whether this claim is true or not, even this store does not know. Thus, the base price is 400 spirit stones, which is definitely not a high price." As the man spoke, he pulled out a fire-red pill furnace from his storage pouch and placed it on the table for everyone to see. With a boom, the atmosphere in the room erupted even though none of the cultivators in the room had spoken yet. Many people were staring dead-on at the pill furnace with fiery gazes. Evidently, they all fancied this item. Han Li quietly sat in the corner, coldly watching all of that was happening. When he heard that the Azure Flood Dragon Banner in his hand also came from this furnace, he couldn't help but feel quite shocked. However, this was only shock. He knew nothing about refining tools, so he naturally would not know the price range for this pill furnace. He definitely would not make a move if it was an item that he didn't know how to use. Han Li could do at least this much. In addition, although the number of spirit stones he had were not low in number, he still had to save them for crucial moments. 450. 470. I put forth 500 spirit stones. No matter how Han Li thought, the price of this pill furnace, named the Red Sky Gathering Furnace, skyrocketed to a frightening amount in no time. 780 stones. This was the bid that a fat-figured person wearing a yellow cloak on his head called out, gritting his teeth. 800. A female cultivator not too far away from the fatty leisurely called out an even higher bid, causing the fatty to grip his hands tightly together. Before his eyes, the prices became sky-high. The others had already given up on bidding. They could only look on with unwillingness and watch the two arrogant foundation establishment cultivators continue to shout out increasingly large prices. 850 pieces. If this lady can call out a bid higher by even 1 spirit stone, this pill furnace will be given to you, the fatty said viciously as he raised the price again, staring at the female cultivator with an angry expression. 851. The fat cultivator's words had just left his mouth when the female cultivator laughed coldly and intentionally called out a number 1 figure higher. This caused the fat cultivator's big face, which was hidden inside the cloak, to appear as red as blood. But after furiously shooting a poisonous expression at the other person for a brief moment, he actually did not call out another bid. Just like that, This Foundation establishment female cultivator spent a very high price and bought this famous pill furnace. Even so, was it worth the amount she paid? Perhaps this time's bidding was too fierce, and it stimulated the nerves of all of the cultivators. Just like that, the originally cold atmosphere in the room instantly heated up, and all the top-grade magic tools and precious materials were completely gobbled up by all of the enthusiastic cultivators. But after 20 or so items had been sold off, Han Li had still yet to see items like the formation flag or formation plate for sale, causing him to grow impatient. Han Li couldn't help but silently think that if none of the items he needed appeared in this auction, he might actually have to make a trip to the Stardust Pavilion. Even buying a few of the most basic spell formation tools was better than having none at all. Just as Han Li was thinking, the skinny and tall man in front listed the name of the next item being auctioned. Top-grade magic tool, a pair of mechanical puppet beasts. Its strength is comparable to that of a 9th-layer Qi condensation disciple. In addition, it is completely faithful and will defend its owner to the death. If you buy this item, it's like having 2 personal bodyguards around you at all times. The base price is only 100 spirit stones. Mechanical puppet beasts. Isn't my own top-grade magic tool also called a puppet bowman? Could they be the same kind of object? Han Li's heart moved, and he sat up straight. He began to watch attentively. The skinny tall male had already brought out 2 shiny black doll-like objects. They were only as large as a fist, and their appearance seemed to somewhat resemble a lion or a tiger, but that similarity was limited. One did not know what kind of strange beast they were based on. There are many guests who have probably not heard of, or very rarely heard of, the Dao school of mechanical puppets. This is a kind of Dao magic that originates from refining magic tools, yet it is completely different from a magic tool. Although not many of us here know this magic is incredibly popular in the westernmost regions. There's even a sect called the Thousand Bamboo School that relied on this to establish their sect, and they have already developed this Dao technique to an extreme. Rumors have it that top-level mechanical puppeteers can contend with late-stage Foundation establishment cultivators. In addition, rating these mechanical beasts as top-grade magic tools was this store's decision, when in reality, according to the official classification of mechanical magics, they should be considered grade 2 puppet beasts. Seeing the cultivators below did not seem interested in these mechanical beasts, and noticing the awkward silence when no one called out a price, this man hurriedly recited the speech that he had memorized beforehand all at once, hoping to pique the cultivators' interest. Although the cultivators below had become somewhat curious after he had finished speaking, no one was willing to do something as silly as pay 100 spirit stones to buy 2 doll-like items. In addition, what use would 2 bodyguards at the 9th layer of Qi condensation be to the cultivators present? 100 spirit stones. A noise sounded out from the corner. There was actually a person who wanted to buy this toy. Instantly, all of the cultivators' gazes turned towards that corner. However, this person was not Han Li. Rather, it was some person with a covered face sitting in another corner. He had covered his entire head with a large gray bag, appearing to be an extremely ridiculous and strange person. 150 spirit stones. Just as other cultivators felt that the strange person was being wastefully extravagant, the sound of another strange, stiff voice calling out a price resounded in the room. Now, all of the cultivators in the room were stunned, and couldn't help but glance towards the person who had called out the new price. A burly person wearing a green cloak sat in the last row of seats, his hands hugging his shoulders. The sound of a new price came from this person's mouth. When all of the people glanced at this person actually stared back at them coldly, not revealing any trace of uneasiness. 200 spirit stones. I will pay 300 pieces. 400. 600. In the blink of an eye, these 2 people raised the price of the puppet beasts one after another to an unbelievable price. At this time, even if the many cultivators in the room were more stupid, they would be able to tell that something was off. Could this pair of puppet beasts be hiding some frightening secret? At this time, this kind of a thought was rising up in all of the cultivators' hearts. All the cultivators in the room glanced at each other a few times, and their hearts began to beat loudly. There were even a few financially strong and hasty individuals who directly entered the bidding. However, a few older cultivators were still somewhat suspicious, even as their hearts stirred. These 2 people couldn't have been secretly hired by the store, could they? Could they have purposefully raised the price of this unprofitable item to incite the rest of them to spend excessively? The cultivators thinking of this were not few in number, and Han Li was one of the most skeptical ones. Thus, he continued to indifferently watch on, seemingly unmoved in any way. I will pay 900 spirit stones with the addition of this item. Seeing the number of cultivators participating in the auction increasing, the burly, strange man panicked in his heart, and he actually pulled out an item from his storage pouch. Then, he took a few large steps forward and stood before the skinny, tall man, placing it on the table. He used a rough tone of voice to say, "This kind of an item is worth many thousands of spirit stones. It's more than enough to exchange for these puppet beasts. Quickly give them to me." Chapter 225, Iron Essence Spirit Medicines. Seeing that the situation was about to get out of hand, the skinny tall male had quickly retrieved the pair of puppet beasts into his storage pouch. Now, seeing that the burly man had pulled out a black, junk metal-like object in order to force him to bring out the auction items that had soared in price, he couldn't help but roll his eyes and say impolitely, "Everybody, please calm down. You there, we will appraise the items worth ourselves, but for now it is more appropriate for you to return to your seat and sit down. Otherwise, this store will assume that you are purposefully creating trouble, and we won't be polite to you anymore." Upon hearing the thin, tall man's threatening words, the burly man grew very angry at first. In his own sect, he was a person with a great identity. When faced with this kind of annoyance, tens of thousands of people would respond to his call. He immediately raised his fists and was about to break out in anger. However, when that person glanced at the strange figure wearing a hood on his head, he discovered that the other person was watching him like a statue. A trace of gloating flitted across his eyes, causing the burly man's heart to quiver. After thinking better of it, he actually forcefully restrained the anger in his heart, suddenly turning around and returning to his seat. Some cultivators who had thought that they would see an entertaining scene play out couldn't help but feel somewhat disappointed. The auction of the puppet beasts was going to continue. However, that black item had already been handed to the trio sitting on the sandalwood chairs. At that time, they were discussing the item in low tones. Although their exact expressions were unclear because they were wearing masks, their solemn attitude was clearly seen by all of the cultivators. That palm-sized, black piece of foundry iron was examined thoroughly multiple times by the three figures before they finally reached a unanimous decision. Then, a black-clothed person stood up in their midst and loudly declared, "One piece of high-quality iron essence, worth 2,000 spirit stones." Then that person returned to his seat without saying another word. Iron essence. The cultivators who heard these two words couldn't help but feel shock in their hearts. The person who had wanted to call out another price immediately shut his mouth tight, unwilling to say another word. Everybody thought with consternation, could this fellow actually be a core formation expert? Otherwise, where did he obtain the iron essence? This was a magic treasure material that could only be refined by a core formation expert's stand fire. Under normal circumstances, cultivators who finished refining this ingredient would immediately assimilate it into their own magic treasures to raise its strength. They would not allow this kind of material to be easily spread out. If even a tiny bit of this iron essence magic treasure ingredient were to be mixed into a regular magic tool, its strength would greatly increase. Even raising a grade was not an impossibility. Thus, the value of this ingredient was outrageous. The burly man from earlier, could he be a core formation cultivator who had purposefully suppressed his aura and pretended to be at the foundation establishment stage? Low-level cultivators could not tell the depth of a core formation cultivator. Just when all of the cultivators were frightened in their hearts and had many suspicions, the skinny, tall man, under the prompting of the three people behind him, finally opened his mouth again and shouted, "Is there anyone else who is willing to place a bid above 2,900? If not, this pair of puppet beasts will all belong to this brother." The skinny, tall man seemingly still wanted to pull the price slightly higher. Thus, he purposefully uttered these words leisurely, obviously intending to stall for time. But which cultivator in the large room still dared to randomly call out prices? Since these people were able to attend this time's auction, they naturally were not common characters. Either they were important figures from a cultivator clan or they had reached the foundation establishment stage. However, when faced with a suspected core formation expert, which one of them dared to ask for trouble? In addition, even if this person was not a core formation cultivator, this person at least had a core formation expert backing him. Thus, even if one coveted the puppet beast secrets, there was no one who was willing to signal themselves out, so they could only stare at the treasure. The strange person who had gone tit for tat with him from the beginning similarly sat without saying a word. Nobody knew if he had been frightened by that piece of iron essence, or if he was embarrassingly short of money and simply couldn't pull out that many spirit stones. Upon hearing about the iron essence, Han Li also felt very shocked. That cheap master of his had lost 2 pieces of iron essence to senior eccentric Qiang. At that time, seeing his master's depressed expression, he knew that this item was extremely precious and valuable. Just like that, this pair of puppet beasts fell into the burly man's hands without any further contest. When he received the puppet beasts, he was so excited that his hands shook slightly. However, this provoked the cultivators' recklessness even more. A large portion of them even wished that they could just seize it in order to precisely research the secrets hidden within. After receiving the puppet beasts, the burly man wearing a cloak immediately left his seat and walked towards the stone doors, but when he reached them, he discovered that the stone doors had actually been tightly shut from the outside. He forcefully pushed on the door twice, but it did not budge an inch. What is the meaning of this? Could it be that even though I bought an item, I'm still not allowed to leave? The man's tone of voice became somber. His accent, which was already somewhat strange, became even more pronounced and uncomfortable to hear. Of course not. When the trades finish, we will immediately open the doors and allow you to leave. However, we cannot do so right now. The person who spoke directly at this moment was not the skinny, tall man running the auction, but rather the black-clothed person sitting on the left. What kind of reasoning is this? I want to leave this place immediately. The man began to rage, and his voice grew increasingly loud. Regretfully, this truly is this store's rule. We use some of these methods to prevent any kinds of unfortunate accidents from occurring. Sir, surely it can't be that you can't even wait this small amount of time. With a low, hoarse voice, the black-clothed person on the right exclaimed in a very gloomy manner. Humph, of course I can continue to wait. Do you think that I'm afraid of you? I've changed my mind. I want to see if any good items will come out next. It was unknown what this man had thought, but he suddenly changed his attitude and swaggered back to his seat. This caused the others to stare blankly and feel greatly shocked. What was this person thinking? Could it be that the longer this person stayed here, the more in danger he would be? At this time, the majority of the cultivators present had already seen that this person truly was in the Foundation establishment realm. Otherwise, how could he be content with being put into his place? However, the secret store's representatives had seemingly known the actual situation of the burly man from the beginning and didn't seem to have any intentions of backing down. Since the burly man did not leave, the auction in the room continued. However, the hearts of the majority of the people did not return to the auction. There was actually the cold scene of 2 items in a row being auctioned without a single person calling out a bid. This caused that skinny, tall man to begin feeling incredibly awkward. However, this auction had also neared its end. The really precious items and the climax of the auction had finally begun. Top-grade spiritual medicine, 1,000-year-old yellow essence mushrooms. I will not say any more superfluous words. Everyone here is most likely even clearer than I am about this medicinal herb's value. The skinny, tall man had just finished saying this when a green jade box appeared in his hand. Then he put on an act and glanced at all of the cultivators. Seeing that everyone's attention had been attracted by the 1,000-year-old herbal medicine, he said, secretly happy. This 1,000-year-old spirit medicine has only appeared a few times in the past 100 years. Buying it to refine spiritual pills will definitely result in realm-shattering creations. It is the optimal opportunity to greatly increase one's magic power. Thus, the base price starts from 500 spirit stones. Having said this, the skinny, tall man pulled off the lid to the jade box, then picked it up and showed the medicinal herb to the cultivators. In an instant, a thick medicinal fragrance filled the entire large room, causing the cultivators to feel both surprised and happy. They were surprised because they had never expected that this kind of unique treasure would appear at this auction. They were happy because if they were able to buy it and use it to refine medicine, it would be exactly like the other person had said, better than any top-grade magic tool. After all, what was being raised was one's own magic power, instead of any kind of borrowed external power. Thus, after the skinny, tall man mentioned the base price, someone impatiently opened their mouth. 1,000 spirit stones. As soon as one cultivator opened his mouth, the price of this spiritual herb had doubled. This caused many people who wanted to call out a price to be infuriated to the point of shouting abuse at them incessantly. However, immediately afterwards, people continued to raise the price. 1,200 spirit stones. 1,000. The people calling out prices continued one after another. In the blink of an eye, it broke through the large bottleneck of 2,000. Meanwhile, Han Li was staring at the 1,000-year-old spiritual medicine on the table in a trance. When he first heard about the 1,000-year-old spiritual herb, he did not pay much attention to it. He only thought that a 1,000-year-old herb had been discovered in another location. However, when the skinny, tall man showed off the 1,000-year-old yellow essence mushroom in the box, Han Li immediately determined that the purported top-grade spiritual medicine was actually one of the two that he had sold to the Myriad Treasure Store earlier. This was because he had personally raised this spiritual medicine, so how could he not recognize it? However, since the spiritual medicine was already in the hands of the Myriad Treasure Store, Han Li wouldn't worry himself about the matter anymore. Thus, after slightly blanking out for a while, Han Li regained consciousness, watching the many cultivators fight with one another as if nothing had happened. Hearing the rapid auctioning noises from these cultivators, Han Li felt somewhat self-satisfied in his heart. After all, to have an item that one previously possessed cause other people to be so frantic could also be considered a source of pride. Chapter 226, 5 Elements Reversal Formation. Chapter 226, 5 Elements Reversal Formation. A few cultivators quickly ran out of spirit stones on hand, and one by one, they started to put up a few rare goods as collateral. In addition, each item became increasingly expensive and rare, causing Han Li to feel overwhelmed. I'll use my 5 elements reversal formation establishment, set in exchange for that spiritual herb. It was unknown who suddenly said those nervous words that caused the rowdy and disorderly cultivators to become quiet. It wasn't because this person's voice was loud, but because he uttered the truly famous name of Reversal 5 Elements Formation. It was a name known to nearly everyone that there were few who did not know. In a few aspects, this formation was absolutely more valuable to few cultivator clans and cultivator sects than the 1,000-year-old spiritual medicine. Apart from covering a small area and having no offensive power, this reputed restrictive formation spell could transform and conceal a sect mountain, confusing and trapping enemies. It wasn't weaker than the large protective formations of those great sects in the slightest. If their own clan or sect had such a wondrous formation, they would have no reason not to use it. However, it was said that if one were not a great formation spell master experienced with this kind of impressive restrictive spell, one would have to spend about a year of hard work and a great amount of labor and resources and still not be able to set it up, not to mention turning such a wondrous formation into a magic tool. If this were true, this auction would be a truly wondrous matter that would greatly broaden one's horizons. When Han Li heard this, a lively expression flashed through his eyes and his spirit was moved. He then turned his head to look at the person who spoke those words. It was an extremely unremarkable chi condensation disciple with a short and thick stature wearing a tiger mask. It was truly not the person one would expect of someone that would possess such a wondrous item. However, a bit of anxiety could be seen from his eye. Your esteemed self possesses a 5 elements reversal formation establishment set. After a moment of surprise, the tall and thin man asked this calmly as he sized up the youth with a gaze full of suspicion. Although he didn't seem very convinced, if the other party truly possessed this formation spell magic tool, the 1,000-year-old medicine herb would naturally go uncontested to this person. When the other cultivators heard this, they all waited to hear the youth's reply. I have it, but as of now, it is incomplete. It can only bring out a tenth of the spell formation strength. But if you were to agree to give this one the medicine herb, this one will guarantee that within several years, he will be able to multiply the might of the formation establishment tools to at least half of its proper strength. When the youth saw so many people look at him, he could not help but panic a bit. As a result, he stuttered out the true matter with regards to the 1,000-year-old medicine herb. So it wasn't true and was instead a defective experiment. When the many cultivators heard this, they were greatly disappointed. Originally, if he truly had this magic tool, they would have bid even greater amounts of spirit stones for it. But now that it was known to be defective, there was naturally no interest. The formation masters of the cultivation world were far rarer than pill and tool refining experts. This was because one must decide to deeply study formations to the point where one would even abandon the great Tao. After all, a person had limited energy. Within a finite amount of time, it was impossible to simultaneously cultivate and delve into the profoundness of formation spells. Thus, there were people who decided to find the spell formation master backing the youth after the termination of the trade fair. After all, a spell formation master capable of researching such a wondrous formation spell magic tool would certainly be capable of laying out a spell formation on site. As for those from a few clans and small sects, so long as they were able to protect a few vital areas with this wondrous formation, even if it wasn't in the form of a mobile magic tool, it made no difference. Could it be that your esteemed self is joking? We are an auction. Who has any reason to wait several years for results? Since I see that you are young, I will drop it this time. The next time you carelessly bid falsely, do not blame this store's representatives for being impolite. When the thin and tall man heard those empty words, his face immediately sunk, and he replied harshly. When the short, coarse youth saw this, his exposed mouth quivered as if he wanted to say something. However, the man in charge of the action paid him no more heed and turned his head, causing the youth to let out a long sigh and helplessly sit back down. When Han Li saw this, he narrowed his eyes. After carefully looking at the youth several times, he firmly memorized the youth's manner of dress and figure. At this moment, the 1,000-year-old herb had reached the price of 2,000 spirit stones, with the addition of several false moonstones from a foundation establishment cultivator. That tall and sturdy man who exchanged the iron essence for the puppet beast did not immediately leave. He actually sat leisurely in his chair as if he wanted to participate in the free trade. But instead, the strange person concealed underneath the hood immediately hurried out as soon as the stone doors opened. This caused a few who were observing from the side to be puzzled. Han Li didn't trouble himself over this matter and instead looked after matters pertaining to himself. He originally planned to wait until the period of free trade to look for the short, coarse youth and see whether or not he could acquire the formation establishment magic tool. Although the 5 elements reversal formation establishment tool could only recreate 1/10 of its original strength, it was enough for Han Li's purposes. After all, he had heard of the grand reputation of this wondrous formation and was convinced that immortals cave. But Han Li did not expect that, when he looked in the direction of the youth, he would be immediately surrounded by 4 to 5 cultivators wanting to discuss some matters with him. This unexpected situation caused Han Li to feel a bit annoyed. At the same time, he was a bit anxious. Could it be that they were the same as him, also wanting to purchase that incomplete formation establishment set? However, Han Li's worry was unfounded. After those people chatted a bit with the youth, they looked at each other in dismay, immediately shaking their heads and leaving. The only person who remained was the short, coarse youth, dejectedly standing there with a hung head. Han Li grew greatly delighted and walked several steps forward. He then coughed and thought of what to say. However, without waiting for him to speak or even taking a look at him, the short, coarse youth dejectedly said, "If you do not have 1,000-year-old spiritual medicine, then please do not disturb me. The spell formation master backing me immediately requires a spiritual medicine to save his life. Currently, we cannot give you any large formations." When Han Li heard this, he felt greatly surprised. But then he said this with a light smile. "What if I have 1,000-year-old spiritual medicine but do not wish to find a spell formation master to set down a formation?" He said this with a joking chuckle. This youth was only a chi condensation at the beginning of the 10th layer. Han Li had no need to be wary of him and thus spoke as he wished. "Senior has spiritual medicine." This youth's consciousness was immediately roused and looked happily toward Han Li. Han Li did not immediately reply, and instead looked in every direction. It seemed as if no one was paying attention to this location. The other cultivators were looking at the others displaying their magic tools for trade. "Shall we go somewhere else to have a chat? There are too many people here," Han Li softly said, pointing to an unremarkable corner. "Yes, of course." The short, coarse youth agreed without the slightest hesitation. They walked over to the nearby corner and were 20 meters away from the nearest cultivator. After Han Li set up a soundproof barrier with ease, they didn't need to worry about others eavesdropping. With this said, ever since Han Li reached Foundation Establishment, he immediately mastered the minor magic techniques he previously couldn't use in the slightest. He had transcended realms from his previously clumsy and slow incapabilities, causing Han Li to feel happy for a long while. This soundproof barrier was a minor magic technique he learned in passing. Senior truly has a spiritual medicine. It must be 1,000 years old or higher. 700 to 800-year-old medicine ingredients are not enough. When the youth saw Han Li set up the barrier, he spouted this out impatiently. It seemed he was very worried. Han Li looked at him indifferently and didn't say anything. Instead, he directly took out the case that was holding the spiritual medicine from his storage pouch. Although it wasn't the 1,000-year-old yellow essence mushroom that had been sold, it was an equivalently aged 1,000-year-old violet osmanthus flowers. Since he didn't specify a particular medicine ingredient, it seemed that so long as the medicinal herb was at least 1,000 years old, it should be fine. According to Han Li's estimates, the youth most likely wanted a 1,000-year-old medicinal herb to extend someone's life. As a result, he wasn't particularly fussy. The youth fixedly stared at the case, his face full of expectation. Your perception is not wrong. It truly is a 1,000-year-old medicinal herb. However, before I open it, shouldn't we have a chat about what item your highness will be using to exchange for this medicinal herb? Han Li asked coldly. Since the other party demanded it from him, it was only natural he would have them bleed for a moment. These rarely seen formation establishing magic tools, Han Li wanted to have a few more on hand as it was always good to have spares. What does Senior wish for? Apart from the magic tools Junior has on hand, there is nothing else worth trading. After the youth heard Han Li's words, he was startled for a moment before saying these words with slight embarrassment. Do you feel that a badly damaged formation establishment magic tool can be exchanged for this 1,000-year-old spiritual medicine? When Han Li heard his words, he did not reveal any expression of disappointment and instead replied with an indifferent voice. The short, coarse youth scratched his head in puzzlement. He strongly felt such an exchange wasn't suitable. Chapter 227, Making Friends. Chapter 227, Making Friends. Is Senior interested in the art of tool refining? The short, stocky youth hesitated for a long time before suddenly forcing out such a sentence, causing Han Li to feel greatly stunned. What do you mean? Han Li felt some uncertainty. Could it be that you want to pass down a tool refining technique? Han Li asked without thinking. Senior guessed it. The only thing I can take out is the tool refining technique that I have on me, the youth exclaimed somewhat dejectedly. When Han Li heard this, he was speechless. He had only wanted to obtain a few formation flag and plate items, who wanted to learn how to refine tools. Even more so, who did this youth think he was? His tool refining technique was so rare. The cultivators who knew about refining tools were not few in number. However, because of ancestral rules, Junior can only give you the experience that I have accumulated. I cannot teach you this technique personally. The youth immediately stammered, complimenting his previous sentence. Han Li blinked his eyes and was at even more of a loss for words. Seeing that Han Li, upon hearing his suggestion, continued to be silent as if he were unwilling, the youth couldn't help but begin to feel anxious. He no longer cared about concealing his identity, and he hurriedly blurted out truthfully. My grandfather used to be a tool refining elder from the Divine Weapons Sect. His technique in tool refining had long since reached great heights. My own tool refining technique was taught to me hand in hand by my grandfather. For Junior to hand over his tool refining heart to you today is already breaking the ancestral rules. As for how much Senior can gain depends completely on Senior's good fortune. However, I can guarantee that they are all secrets that have never been spread to outsiders from the cultivation world. Han Li's expression finally changed upon hearing that this youth was a descendant of a Divine Weapons Sect tool refining elder. Didn't this Divine Weapons Sect stand side by side with the Heavenly Star Sect and the Thousand Wonders Monastery as one of the three great sects in the state of Yuan-Wu? The tool refining techniques there, as well as the formations of the Heavenly Star Sect and the Thousand Wonders Monastery's Tao of Talismans, were all incredibly well known by many cultivators in the neighboring states. In this way, it seemed that the other person's tool refinement insight was truly not average. Although Han Li would most likely not end up learning it, even having it in his possessions could be a bargaining chip. Who knew if in the future he would have some use for it? Han Li made a decision in his heart. However, he still asked, can your 5 elements reversal formation establishment magic tools really be further improved? It definitely can be. My friend has long reached perfection in the Tao of formations. Adding on my tool refining technique, improving this formation establishment magic tool will not pose a big problem. Seeing that Han Li asked that question, the youth knew that he had most likely agreed. Thus, he immediately became joyful and assured Han Li, patting his chest. Han Li nodded his head and did not continue speaking. However, he took the lid off the box in his hand, and immediately a medicinal fragrance filled with spiritual qi filled the soundproof barrier. The youth lightly sniffed it a few times, then used his eyes to closely examine it several more times. The delight in his eyes greatly increased, and he nodded his head repeatedly to express his satisfaction. Seeing this, Han Li gently smiled. He reached out his hand and handed it over. The youth hurriedly and happily stretched out his hand to receive it. However, when he grabbed a corner of the box, wanting to take it away, it seemed that this box containing the spiritual medicine had grown roots on Han Li's hand and did not budge at all. This caused the youth to stare blankly, and a surprised expression was revealed on his face. Han Li, seeing the other person raise his head and look at him at a loss, couldn't help but sigh. It seemed like this individual truly was an influential family's young master who had not experienced many trials and hardships. He still did not recognize such an obvious hint from Han Li. Helplessly, Han Li could only use his mouth to clarify for the other person. Shouldn't you also take out that set of magic tool and your tool refining insights? That way, we can exchange the goods at the same time. Isn't doing it this way somewhat more appropriate? Oh, Senior spoke correctly. Junior forgot this matter in my excitement. The short, stocky youth finally was enlightened, and he let go of the box, his face blood red. He clumsily pulled out a stack of items from his storage pouch. Here are 18 formation plates and 36 formation flags. These are the complete set of the 5 elements reversal formation establishment magic tools. As long as you follow the instructions on this piece of jade and set them up exactly as described, the formation will immediately take effect. Also, this Xianxia Technique Insight Manual was compiled from 20 years of my tool refining experience. I hope that Senior can avoid spreading it around in the future to prevent the Divine Weapons Sect from coming to your door. This is because many of the tool refining techniques in here are all secrets of the Divine Weapons Sect. The youth explained in great detail. In addition, he also gave Han Li a significant piece of advice. When Han Li heard these words, his impression of this youth became even more favorable. Another idea suddenly emerged in his heart. After hesitating for a moment, Han Li stuffed the box in his hand into the bosom of the other person, then received the stack of item from the other person's hand. Han Li's sudden movements, which were contrary to his usual behavior, actually caused the short, stocky youth to feel at a loss, as if he didn't know what he had done wrong. Xianxia Technique Insight. Xianxia is your name, right? What is your surname? Han Li changed the indifferent expression he had used earlier. He received the items and gave them a few cursory glances before amiably asking the youth. Junior's surname is Jai Chi Xiao. Does Senior have any more instructions? The youth hesitated for a moment, but he still ended up speaking. However, he did not know what Han Li's intentions were. Nothing really. I just wanted to tell you that although I have received your collection of insights, I will use a sealing technique to seal it and will not touch it for 5 years. If in these 5 years, you can truly successfully improve this spell formation set for me, I will return the manual to you without having looked at a single page. What do you think? Really? Then Junior can't thank you enough. Senior can rest assured concerning this matter of improving the 5 elements reversal formation establishment magic tools. Even if Junior's friend does not successfully improve it, I will still try to persuade him to make a truly great formation for Senior. After hearing Han Li say this, the youth was overjoyed and hurriedly assured him. Han Li gently smiled and picked up the Xianxia Experience Manual, holding it in his hands. Following Han Li's muttered incantations, a row of silver runes suddenly appeared on his hands. After circling in his palms for a while, they entered the book and vanished. At the same time, a silver light flashed across the Xianxia Experience Manual, and a faint silver light dissipated from it. This caused the entire book to suddenly become a chunk of silver, with no way of opening it even a tiny bit. Okay, I've finished sealing it. Now, circulate your spiritual chi through the seal. In this way, when we make the exchange in the future, you will know whether or not I've broken the seal. Han Li sealed the book, then threw it over. The youth caught the book with surprise and happiness. The youth stared at it slack-jawed for a moment, but with a stomp of his foot, he left some spiritual chi on the seal. Then, with an expression both of doubt and gratitude, he returned the book to Han Li. At this time, Han Li had pretty much figured out the other person's state of mind. He knew that immediately gaining the other person's trust was an impossible task. But when he returned the sealed book to the other person after a number of years, he would presumably be able to secure the friendship of both the youth and that magic formation master, building up a relationship with them. Of course, determining whether or not the other person was really worth building a relationship with still required them to interact for a long period of time before it would become clear. Thus, Han Li stowed the book away. After asking for a method to communicate with the youth, he floated away without another superfluous sentence and left the area. The youth was left in the same location with an expression of disbelief. He had obtained this 1,000-year-old spiritual medicine just like that. He fiercely squeezed the hard medicine box, and an expression of both confusion and excitement was revealed in his eyes. Han Li naturally was in a very good mood, and he headed towards the tool refining store. Xianxia's tool refining technique and his backer's identity as a magic formation master were much more valuable than a lifeless book. If he could build up relations with them, perhaps in the future it would be very helpful for his cultivation path. Han Li had no doubts about this. Han Li finally returned to the store that had received his contract. There, the white-haired elder was waiting anxiously for his arrival. When he saw that Han Li really had kept his promise and returned, the store owner immediately beamed with joy and had the dark-skinned man quickly bring tea and rare fruits. He personally accompanied Han Li to sit down at the table and incessantly addressed him as senior. Although Han Li was a thick-skinned person, his face still faintly blushed. Next, Han Li took out the centipede's back shell out in front of the elder. This caused the elder's expression to change, and he immediately picked up a small piece, carefully caressing it and identifying it. This is the shell of an advanced grade 1 poisonous insect demonic beast. It truly is a very good tool-refining ingredient, especially since the demonic beasts in the outside world are decreasing in number. Encountering a poisonous insect demonic beast is an especially rare circumstance, the elder said with a smile. The wrinkles on his face seemed to have smoothed out. The materials the other person possessed were all within his expectations. They weren't junk metal or any kind of miscellaneous garbage. Instead, they were actually the outer shell of a poisonous insect demonic beast. They were extremely good materials, highly suited for crafting armor or shield-like magic tools. According to his estimation, prior to being refined, these bug shells could forcefully receive an attack from a top-grade magic tool without any serious damage. If it were successfully refined, it naturally could effortlessly reach the ranks of a top-grade magic tool. The white-haired elder became happier the more he looked at it, and he happily picked up these pieces of shell, about to begin. However, he was stopped by Han Li. "Store owner, don't be hasty. There are still some ingredients that I haven't brought out yet." Seeing the elder's frazzled behavior, Han Li couldn't help but knit his eyebrows together and wonder if he had found himself the wrong tool-refining master. Chapter 228, Puppet Cultivator. Chapter 228, Puppet Cultivator. "There's more." The elder first stared blankly, but then he immediately became even happier. He laughed giddily for quite some time. Although he didn't know what sort of materials Han Li would pull out next, saving the best for last was a principle of common sense. His gaze towards Han Li was filled with even more expectation. Although Han Li was somewhat doubtful of this store owner's tool-refining methods, he would be unable to find another tool-refining master that he trusted more for some time. Thus, he could only somewhat hesitatingly place the inky flood dragon's raw materials onto the table. However, he had already decided in his heart that if this elder was unable to identify the origins of these materials, it would prove that the other person's experience and methods would be problematic. If that time came, he would at most allow the elder to refine the hard shell in front of him. As for the high-quality materials from the inky flood dragon, he would have to wait to find a superior tool-refining master. Since Han Li had made this plan, he naturally followed the elder's expression and movements even more closely. In the end, when he saw the pile of materials that Han Li had taken out, the elder spat out his mouthful of clear tea onto the ground in front of him with a puche. "This is a flood dragon's hide, even its horns, fangs. These are its eyes. Heavens, could Senior have single-handedly killed an evil flood dragon?" The white-haired store owner was shocked out of his normal behavior. He gazed at the materials in front of him with disbelief, incessantly muttering to himself. No wonder this elder was so shocked. Demonic beasts like the flood dragon had already disappeared from nearby cultivation worlds for a long time. Even if there were some in hiding, this kind of evil flood dragon, which had seemingly evolved into a grade 2 demonic beast, was comparable to a cultivator beyond the foundation establishment stage. Apart from core formation cultivators, how could average foundation establishment cultivators possibly be its opponent? Even if that many cultivators in foundation establishment took action together, the pile of flood dragon materials in front of him was too complete. It was practically as if Han Li had dismembered an entire flood dragon and directly carried it over. Could he have taken ownership of the complete corpse for himself, leaving nothing for the other cultivators? Or did this person have some terrifying method that allowed him to take care of this flood dragon on his own? The elder's imagination began to run wild as he fumbled around with these materials. It was only now that a reverent attitude appeared in his heart towards Hanli. The fact that the store owner had been able to immediately recognize these materials was somewhat beyond Hanli's expectations. He originally believed that even if the other person was able to recognize these items, it would perhaps still require a lot of time and energy for him to do so. But since the elder had so easily identified the materials, Hanli gained some more faith in him. Store owner Sue recognized them so quickly. This actually has assured me a lot. Then, Elder Sue, please begin refining, Hanli politely said after thinking things over in his heart. Okay, Senior, please have faith. When Sue was still an apprentice, I refined a flood dragon corpse once before with my father. My grasp of it will definitely not be small, the elder replied, nodding his head repeatedly. He held one of the inky flood dragon's talons in his hand, unwilling to put it down. Seeing this scene, Hanli felt that it was somewhat comical. However, he also understood that this elder most likely was a person who was obsessed with refining tools. Otherwise, even if the materials were better, he would not have lost his self-control like this. In this way, however, Hanli felt even more at peace, since this meant that this person's mastery of tool refining should be pretty exceptional. Thus, the elder led Hanli to the rear courtyard, bringing the materials with him. After half a month, Hanli finally walked out of the store's front door. He slowly left with a light smile on his face after turning around and gazing at the store. When he was outside of the market's prohibited flying zone, Hanli lifted his hand, and a small, exquisite white boat shot out from his sleeve. It floated in front of him a few feet off the ground and began to gently shake. Hanli gazed at it lovingly for a moment before flicking his finger. An azure streak of magic power hit the boat. Instantly, the small boat slowly expanded in size. After a brief moment, it had become a small canoe that could fit several people. Hanli's figure gently shook when he saw this scene, and he got on the boot. Then, in a flash of white light, Hanli disappeared along with the boat, appearing 30 feet or so in the air. This divine wind boat that was refined using the inky flood dragon's fins and tail is really an incredibly flying magic tool. Although it is far from being able to contain as many people as the masked moon sect's heavenly divine moon boat and has no defensive abilities, based on speed alone, it should be a very rarely seen flying magic tool. In this way, I will never have to use the leaf-shaped magic tool that travels as slowly as a turtle. Hanli said to himself as he stood on the bow of the ship. A trace of happiness was revealed on his face. Hanli suddenly sent his spiritual power into the small boat's frame. In an explosion of bright white light, the divine wind boat immediately became a streak of white and shot forwards. Its speed was extremely fast, more than enough to cause regular cultivators to stare, tongue-tied. Hanli sat at the front of the ship, gently closing his eyes and reveling in the sensation of speed that he had never before experienced. He reckoned that even if he were to fly at half the speed of the divine wind boat, he could return to his cave in little more than an hour. Then, he would prepare to set up the weakened 5 elements reversal formation. Once he finished, he could cultivate in peace. Just as Hanli was thinking this, he suddenly felt a strong burst of spiritual chi flying speedily towards his divine wind boat from a location below him. Although he didn't know what was attacking him, based on the immense spiritual chi that he felt, if it were to hit the small boat, the outcome would be the destruction of the boat and his death. Hanli was both surprised and furious, and he abruptly opened his eyes wide. Then, the small boat below him suddenly doubled in speed, whizzing numerous tens of feet away. At the same time, a huge column of yellow light passed through the location where Hanli was just in a moment ago, flying into the distance without scattering. This caused Hanli's expression to become gloomy. Could there be people who knew I would pass through this place and set up an ambush for me ahead of time? Hanli could not help but think this in his surprise and fury. Then, he immediately pulled out 2 azure-red dual-colored spheres, gently touching them together. A ping sounded out. Instantly, a surge of dense, azure-red fog simultaneously shot out of the 2 spheres, rapidly enveloping Hanli. In addition, it continued to expand. In the blink of an eye, it had become a huge azure-red cloud roughly 100 feet in size. Hanli's figure completely disappeared in the cloud of fog. With the protection of this azure-red cloud, Hanli slightly lowered his guard, coldly gazing at the earth below. When he saw clearly the circumstance below, Han Li's jaw dropped wide open, and he had no way of closing it for quite some time. This was because there was a gang war going on below him. 4 of 5 Foundation establishment cultivators were at a disadvantage, confronting nearly 100 enemies that had completely surrounded them. In addition, their opponents were all expressionless and spiritless. They were actually all tiger and leopard mechanical puppet beasts. There were even a few humanoid mechanical puppets, very similar to the one in Han Li's storage pouch. Although the seemingly slow movements of the puppets made them seem easy to deal with, when one puppet was defeated or destroyed by these cultivators, magic tools, a few more puppets would walk out of the nearby forest and reinforce them, causing the numbers of puppets surrounding them to be constant and unchanging. In addition, these puppets' offensive abilities were very frightening. When these mechanical beasts occasionally opened their mouths, a huge column of light as big as a bowl, identical to the one that had almost hit Han Li, would shoot from their mouths. However, their columns of light were multicolored, representing their various attributes. It seemed as if Han Li had been accidentally shot at by them. As for those humanoid puppets, they were even stronger. There were puppet bowmen that were the same as the puppet bowmen in Han Li's possession. They directly shot out finger-wide multicolored light arrows from the long bow in their hands. Although their strength was not as great as the light columns shot by the mechanical beasts, they were superior because they formed an endless onslaught. If it weren't for the fact that these cultivators had combined their efforts to set up a huge barrier, perhaps they would have long since died under the indiscriminate barrage of light arrows and columns. However, what gave them the greatest headache was still those spear and saber-wielding close combat puppets. Not only were those puppets wearing heavy armor, the weapons in their hands all shone with light, indicating that they were all genuine low to mid-grade magic tools. Although there were only 10 of them or so, they attacked incessantly after thoroughly surrounding the barrier. Under the onslaught, the barrier began to crumble, and its brightness fluctuated. If it wasn't for the fact that there were 2 cultivators pressing their hands to the barrier and replenishing its magic power at all times, it would have most likely been broken through numerous times already. It wasn't that the cultivators really couldn't do anything about these puppets. They were, after all, Foundation establishment cultivators. Not only was their magic power very deep, the magic tools they possessed were also frighteningly powerful. In this small amount of time, 30 or 40 puppets had already been demolished by their attacks. However, no matter how strong the magic tools in their hands were, the number of puppets in the forest seemed to be inexhaustible. They continuously supplemented the existing number without stopping, and so the battle became one of attrition. The more these cultivators fought, the colder their hearts grew. Han Li, hiding in midair within the azure cloud, was also stunned by what he saw. It seemed as if, in the span of time, nobody had yet discovered his existence. That column of light had been nothing but an accident. Finally, one cultivator ran out of patience. He suddenly added on numerous layers of protective spells onto his body. Then, waving a banner-shaped defensive magic tool, he directly escaped out of the large barrier, flying towards the sky. It seemed as if he wanted to flee from this area. Seeing this, the other few cultivators couldn't help but break the silence and begin to curse him out. However, their curses had just left their mouths when a gigantic column of light tens of feet wide suddenly shot out from the forest. In a flash, it directly hit the cultivator in midair. He was immediately turned into a fireball, leaving him no time to even whimper before he fell to the ground. Whether he was alive or dead was a mystery. Chapter 229, Huge Tiger. The curses of the few cultivators who were furious after their companion left them without saying anything had already disappeared. They gazed at each other, seeing a trace of dread in each other's eyes. Just then, although they had been in an extremely disadvantageous position, they actually did not feel any worry in their hearts apart from a slight feeling of vexation. They all reckoned that even if they couldn't kill off all these mechanical puppets, escaping through the air was still something that could be easily accomplished. But now the escapee's fate immediately shocked them out of their wishful dreams. He had so many protective spells on his body, and he was even wielding a defensive magic tool, but even so, he was actually unable to withstand that column of light in the slightest. How could this not frighten them? In addition, the higher one's cultivation base, the more one feared death. They had, with great difficulty, achieved a point where they could live slightly longer than regular people. There was also the possibility that they could live even longer, so how could they be willing to die so easily? However, that frighteningly thick column of light was simply too powerful. if it hadn't been directed at the fleeing cultivator, but rather at their protective barrier. These people really didn't know if they could have received it. The more these cultivators thought about it, the more they panicked. They couldn't help but begin to think about retreating. But now, even if they wanted to retreat, the opponent would not easily let them go now that he had the advantage. This caused them to be caught in a dilemma. Hiding in the clouds high above their heads, Han Li was also shocked by that domineering column of light to the point that his body emanated cold air. Now he was even more unwilling to rashly reveal himself. However, he was also not very willing to just leave this place in this manner. Thus, he could rely on the outstanding speed of the divine wind boat to escape even after being discovered. Han Li continued to stay in midair, observing what transpired. However, the azure-red cloud of smoke that Han Li's magic tool had transformed into was truly somewhat eye-catching if he left it floating in midair above the cultivators and puppets. Luckily, while Han Li had been in mid-flight, he had greatly increased the altitude of the small boat to a distance of about 1,000 feet. Thus, Han Li had yet to be discovered by the surrounded cultivators or the figure in the forest controlling the puppets. However, Han Li also knew that this method could not be carried on indefinitely, but if he were to retrieve the cloud of smoke, he would definitely be exposed in midair. Besides, the top-grade magic tool, Azure Fire Miasma, that had been refined from a pair of flood dragon eyes could conceal Han Li's figure, causing enemies to be unable to determine his exact location. In addition, the remaining blood of the inky flood dragon's Dan had been incorporated in the dense, azure-red fog. This would cause the people who unwittingly came into contact with the cloud to feel dizzy and lightheaded, slowly being poisoned without even knowing. With such an incredible defensive and stealthy magic tool at hand, how could Han Li not choose to use it? In his desperation, Han Li suddenly saw a gray cloud floating in a nearby location above where he was hiding. He instantly rejoiced in his heart and slowly drew near to it. Finally, both him and the protective cloud around him entered the cloud. Now, any traces of Han Li had been completely covered up. Now that he didn't have to worry about being discovered, he continued to watch the battle down on the ground with reassurance. Evidently, that supreme beam of light earlier had dispelled the self-confidence of these Foundation establishment cultivators. Thus, although they were still attacking with their various magic tools, and the fight appeared to be very intense, Han Li could see that the strength of their attacks was far weaker than they were originally. This was obviously because everyone had their own ulterior motives, and appeared to be unwilling to resist the enemy together anymore. Just as Han Li was quietly shaking his head, an elderly cultivator within the barrier seemingly also became aware that something was wrong. He suddenly yelled loudly towards the forest, "Does Sir really want to continue the slaughter? We are all disciples from various sects of the state of Yuan Wu. If you kill us, you will have wronged the state of Yuan Wu's entire cultivation world. Are you not afraid of incurring a fatal disaster?" Fatal disaster. If you had said so before I killed that cultivator who had wanted to fly away, perhaps I would have considered it. However, now that someone has already died, offending once is still an offense. It would be better to kill everybody off. Perhaps this way, no one will know of this matter. We don't have any malicious intentions. As long as you are willing to make peace, we will swear an oath that we definitely will keep this matter a secret. A significantly younger cultivator hurriedly vowed. HMPH, swearing an oath. I don't believe in such trifles. You guys were stealthily following behind me for such a long time, yet you still say that you don't have any malicious intentions. Could it be that you want to invite me to a meal? Besides, I'm not a person from the state of Yuan Wu. Even if I did offend the cultivation world of your state, what can you do? Do you want to follow me back to the 1,000 Bamboo School to demand justice? If that's really the case, I very much admire your sect's elders' boldness. An extremely harsh voice came from within the forest. Upon hearing this voice, Han Li thought that it sounded very familiar. It's him, Han Li quietly thought, somewhat surprised. Based on the sound of his voice, it was definitely the burly man who had bought the mechanical puppet beast at the auction. Hearing their exchange, it was obvious that these cultivators had secretly followed this person right after the auction had ended. They probably wanted to use some dishonorable methods to discover the puppet beast's secrets. Who knew that this 1,000 Bamboo School fellow became aware of their actions a long time ago and actually laid a trap for them, instantly trapping them here? Everybody, we have no choice but to go all out against him. He has already made it clear that he wants to silence us. The first cultivator to speak was not stupid. He immediately attempted to arouse the fighting spirit of the other cultivators, intending to fight to the death. You even have the qualifications to go all out against me. Don't talk about going all out if you can't even win against my puppet beast army. I have toyed around enough with you people. It's best if I hurry up and send you on your way." The burly man's tone was still just as harsh, but the killing intent in his words was undoubtedly revealed. Just as his words left his mouth, a loud, earth-shaking sound suddenly emerged from within the forest. Then, booming, heavy footsteps came charging out of the forest, causing the cultivators inside the barrier and Han Li, who was in midair, to glance around wildly, not knowing exactly what had occurred. Although the footsteps were very heavy, they were very quick. In the blink of an eye, they had arrived in an area nearby the forest. Now, all of the people could see what was happening clearly. A roughly 50 or 60-foot tall puppet tiger leapt out of the forest. The burly cultivator, still wearing a cloak, was naturally sitting on the head of the giant tiger. Upon seeing that the puppet tiger was so enormous, the few cultivators were all secretly shocked and couldn't help but think of the huge column of light that they had seen earlier. It was likely that it had been shot by this beast. After it appeared, the burly man did not say anything superfluous and directly patted the tiger's head. Instantly, the puppet tiger beneath him slowly opened its lower jaw. Faint white light began to condense in its huge mouth. The other puppets that were attacking the barrier instantly stopped one by one, retreating a few steps in an orderly fashion. These cultivators obviously knew that the situation did not look good, so all of them reached out their hands and pressed them against the barrier. This was the only barrier that could save their lives. As for escaping the barrier and flying away, everybody had once harbored this idea but learned from the unfortunate cultivator's mistake. Nobody dared to lightly make such a move. The huge column of white light appeared once again. This time, the domineering light column was actually forcefully blocked by the cooperative efforts of the few cultivators with the help of the barrier, temporarily creating a stalemate. Although Han Li was very high up in the sky, by virtue of his extraordinary eyesight, he could still clearly see that these cultivators did not appear happy even though they had successfully blocked the column of light. Instead, their faces became pale after pouring such large quantities of their spiritual energy into this barrier. However, Han Li believed that this destructive attack could not continue for long and would be over before long. The few cultivators inside the barrier also seemed to understand this principle, so they each continued to grit their teeth and bitterly hold on. As expected, the column of light was maintained for a brief moment before gradually thinning, then disappearing from the tiger's mouth. Having received a new lease on life, the cultivators revealed joyful expressions as they finally retrieved the hands that they had placed on the barrier, letting out a big sigh. However, the burly man coldly laughed upon seeing this. He suddenly uncovered a secret panel on the tiger's head, then flipped his hand and tossed a mid-grade fire attribute spirit stone into opening. Then, the originally extinguished white light in the tiger's mouth began to shine again, causing the other cultivators to become completely dazed when they saw this scene. Han Li gnawed on his lips even more, speechless at the extravagant expense. One mid-grade spirit stone for an all-out attack. How was this a battle tactic? It was clearly using piles of spirit stones to forcefully bash these cultivators. It seemed like the 1,000 Bamboo School in his faraway country was extremely rich and had huge stores of spirit stones. Just as Han Li's imagination was running wild, the cultivators who were originally able to work together finally scattered under the extremely large threat facing them. This was because the magic power they had remaining was not very much. Continuing to forcefully resist would only bring them an earlier death. Thus, it would be better for them to each rely on their own luck and escape individually. As expected, the burly man willed the huge tiger to attack two of the cultivators one after the other with the huge column of light. Their fates were almost the same as the first individual. Their bodies were charred black, and their remains were truly too horrible to look at. Chapter 230, Trap. Two cultivators flew off into the distance to escape. In the blink of an eye, they disappeared into the sky. The burly man sat astride the tiger and coldly looked at them as they departed. It seemed he didn't want to pursue them at all. Hiding in the clouds, Han Li felt a bit bewildered. A moment ago, it seemed this person was vicious and merciless. There was no way he would let them off so easily unless, could he have something up his sleeve? As Han Li was casually making a few guesses, he suddenly heard the ice-cold voice of the burly man. "Your esteemed self, you've been watching this scene for quite a long time. Are you waiting for an opportunity to dispose of this elderly man?" When Han Li heard this, he was greatly startled. Could it be that, although I was hiding at such a high altitude, he was still able to see me? With this thought, Han Li couldn't help but gulp. He felt his heart beating in his throat. After witnessing the ferocity of these mechanical puppets, Han Li did not wish to suffer the same fate as the other cultivators and become a target of the huge tiger's attacks. The speed of that transcendent light beam was far too fast, and its might was frightening. According to Han Li's estimates, if he were to directly face it, apart from fleeing with the utmost speed on his divine wind boat, he would truly have no other method to safely escape the light beam attack. After slight consideration, Han Li couldn't help but want to escape far away through the sky and avoid provoking fatal disaster. But after he took a look at the burly man's actions, all thoughts of this immediately disappeared. That was because the direction the puppets pointed their weapons was not toward him in the sky. Instead, they were pointed toward a small mound of earth not far away. Han Li was so startled, he nearly bit his own tongue. There was actually a third person here, yet Han Li hadn't noticed him in the slightest. Crash! The sound of earth shifting drifted over from the small earth mound. A single eccentric wearing a gray hood on his head emerged, standing opposite of the burly man. So it really was you. Who in the world are you? It seems as if you know a bit about the secrets of this mechanical puppet. The burly man looked at him with a bone-chilling glare, viciously staring at this eccentric. Huang Long, I haven't seen you for so many years. It seems your fiery temperament hasn't changed. After a moment of silence from the hooded eccentric, he said a few words that caused the burly man and Han Li to feel great amazement. How do you know who I am? Are you an acquaintance of this one named Huang? Having heard the other party speak out his name, the burly man could not help but reveal an expression of shock. However, since his identity was already exposed, his disguise was worthless. He then bluntly tore off his cloak and threw it to the floor. A fierce-looking man with a short, sallow hair was revealed. You've properly abandoned being your 1,000 bamboo school's great protector. Now you are 5,000 kilometers away doing what? Could it be because you wanted to conceal the half-complete great development technique in your puppet beast? The eccentric ignored the burly man's actions and asked this leisurely. You're still not revealing your identity. Don't blame me for being impolite. Having heard the other party attack his greatest secrets, Huang Long's expression changed as he hastily berated back with a stern voice. Don't tell me you forgot. I, the one who originally taught you the first layer chant of the great development technique in secret. After a moment of hesitation, the eccentric eventually divulged this, causing the other party's face to greatly change. Huan Long stepped back several times. Your senior martial brother Lin. Impossible. Senior martial brother Lin passed away many years ago. You dare to play with me? I will take your life. After a moment of shock, he immediately yelled back furiously. Then with a vicious appearance, he waved his hand. The hundreds of puppets immediately stepped forward to surround the eccentric from afar. It seems that junior martial brother Huang still hasn't forgotten his feelings from old times. This makes brother very happy. The eccentric's eyes suddenly grew soft, and he tore off the hood on his head, revealing his true identity. Senior martial brother Lin. Martial uncle Lin. The large man and Han Li, who had been paying attention this entire time, nearly shouted at the same time. However, while the large man actually shouted out loud, Han Li mere cried out in his mind. This eccentric was the old man named Lin who liked carving. Han Li had seen him in that stone room the day he entered Yellow Maple Valley. Because the small monkey he was carving at the time was extremely adorable and lifelike, the old man had left a deep impression on Han Li, so Han Li was thus able to recognize his present appearance. It truly is senior brother Lin. Why does senior brother have such an aged appearance? Furthermore, you haven't already. Although the large man yelled this, he still went through a moment of disbelief before grabbing the senior martial brother Lin in front of him with both hands, wearing an expression of great emotion. He, junior martial brother Huang, this brother only faked his death that day. That death was only. What are you doing? Han Li's martial uncle Lin was saying this with a smile, but his expression immediately changed. He suddenly shook off the hands of this junior martial brother Huang with fright. 2 deep wounds as thin as chopsticks appeared on his wrists. Black blood freely bled from the wounds. There was clearly poison within them. It seems senior martial brother Lin's mind has spoiled during these many years of hiding. How could you be this careless and let your junior martial brother injure your wrists? Tusk. That was black thread venom that I acquired from the venomous poison sect with quite some difficulty. I'm afraid that it is quite hard to get rid of. This is senior martial brother's fault. Since you feigned your death, How could you want to form a relation with your previous subordinate and futilely try to steal the second half of the Great Development Technique? The current school master Jin is very unhappy, so he sent this junior martial brother to come and clear the weeds. Huang Long coldly chuckled several times before mocking him. Good, good. Truly my good junior martial brother is passionate toward me. After a short moment of fury, senior martial brother Lin quickly regained his calm. He hastily moved his hands as fast as the wind, forcing some of the poisonous blood out. He then took out a green jade bottle and poured all of the yellow medicine powder it contained down his throat. Rigidly staring at the large, yellow-haired man, he said with an ice-cold expression, "It seems the information that my good subordinate gave me was all false. The second half of the Great Development Technique simply does not reside within the puppet beast. This was all a trap to lure me in. But what baffles me is how the secret shop managed to cooperate with you in this manner. Money moves people's hearts. This proverb from the mortal world applies to the cultivation world all the same. So long as the school pays enough, nothing is impossible," Huang Long said with a slanted mouth. Then he turned his head and yelled off to the forest at the side, "Come out. Everyone come and see the handsome and confident schoolmaster Lin's only son, the great martial brother Lin." He, little sister has heard of senior martial brother Lin's reputation for a long time. It is a pity that she had entered the sect late and didn't get the chance to see your face. Humph, what senior martial brother Lin? I only see the corpse of an old dog. The voice of a dainty woman and the coarse voice of a jealous man came from the woods. A man and a woman then walked out side by side. Let me introduce senior martial brother to these two. They are new great protectors of the school. Huang Long was currently thinking of willfully teasing him for a moment. This senior martial brother Lin had pressured him from above during those past years. However, without even finishing his sentence, he already knew he had fallen into senior martial brother Lin's trap. Senior martial brother Lin's figure suddenly whirled as he disorderly waved his hands without stopping. Black specks radiated in a large area, shooting out from his body in all directions. Then the countless radiant specks on the floor immediately flickered without end. One by one, small and fully armed puppet soldiers emerged and grew in size. There were more than 200 in the vicinity. It was an extremely marvelous sight. Be careful, this fellow has reached the third layer of the Great Development Technique and is able to control these many puppets. We must all tangle him down by any means or else he will escape. So long as the poison in his body flares up, even with his heavenly skill, he can only wait to be captured. After Huang Long said this, he ordered his subordinates to attack. After the man and woman glanced at each other, they also released 200 puppets and began to attack. Suddenly, a new wave of puppet attacks was launched. All kinds of light arrows and beams were shot out endlessly. At the same time, there were many armed puppet soldiers and puppet beasts tangled in combat. This scene caused Han Li, who was viewing this from above, to be dumbstruck. Although he couldn't see clearly what had happened towards the end, he was able to vaguely make out about 70 to 80%. That senior martial brother Lin, whom he had met before formally entering the sect, actually originated from the Thousand Bamboo School. Furthermore, he was the child of a schoolmaster. But it was clear he had already lost his influence when he chose to conceal himself at Yellow Maple Valley until now. But because he sought to acquire this great development technique, martial Uncle Lin had become the subject of the new schoolmaster's wrath. Members of his former sect were sent to thoroughly exterminate him. When Han Li clearly understood this relationship, he could not help but sigh. Then he looked at the frenzy below. He knew that this wasn't something an initial stage foundation establishment cultivator could opportunistically stick his hand into, but rather something he should escape from as best as he could out of fear that he could get himself caught up in it. Clearly understanding his own interests, Han Li immediately put away the Azure Fire miasma and moved his divine wind boat with the greatest speed, immediately turning into a rainbow streak that cut through the sky. Han Li's extremely large movements were naturally noticed by the four below, causing them to grow greatly frightened. They could not help but slow down their fighting. None of them expected that someone had actually been eavesdropping on their conversation all along. It seemed that the person who had heard their secret wasn't weak, but after seeing Han Li tactfully flee into the distance without intending to help anyone, the four looked at each other and wordlessly agreed to continue their battle. Chapter 230, One Disaster Knocking on the Door. Chapter 231, Disaster Knocking at the Door. Flying as fast as he could, Han Li returned to his Immortals cave after a short while. Without doing anything further, he took out the formation establishment Jade slip that Xianxia had given him and immersed his consciousness into it, carefully reading the method of using the formation establishment magic tools. Han Li decided to push his previous plans to the side and first set up the great formation around his immortals cave. After all, those cultivators were fighting not too far away. He did not feel safe. The setup of the 5 elements reversal formation was quite simple. After precisely inserting the formation flags and burying the formation plates, he was required to place down several small-scale magic formations with spirit stones outside of the formation center to provide the large formation with sufficient spiritual power. Like that, the large formation was able to immediately function. Furthermore, the formation's master only needed to know a few simple control commands and use the master formation flag on hand to ceaselessly shift and control the formation patterns, trapping enemies within illusions. Han Li inserted the formation flags and buried the formation's plates. Then he begrudgingly embedded several mid-grade spirit stones. These were half of all the spirit stones he possessed, and the loss caused his heart to ache for the majority of the day. But because he didn't want to reduce the power of this great formation, he could only resign himself to parting with his wealth. Though if he were to exchange some spiritual medicines of a certain age at the market city, Han Li would be able to acquire a great amount of spirit stones. But the odds of others discovering his secret and putting him under torturous interrogation would increase threefold. If he were not cautious and careful, he could have been attacked from all sides like that scene he just witnessed. After testing the large formation's operations, it seemed quite effective, but the specific defensive trapping ability could only be tested during an enemy trespass. But regarding its ability to completely shroud the vicinity of the Immortals' cave for several acres without the slightest of abnormalities, Han Li found it to be greatly worth it. Han Li, now feeling completely safe, returned to his chambers and started to think about his cultivation. If he wanted even the slightest chance of entering the cycle of core formation, he would have to possess a top-grade cultivation technique, talent that 1 in 10,000 didn't even possess, as well as the greatest of fortunes. The problem of foundation establishment fundamentally didn't compare. After all, foundation establishment only required sufficient aptitude and 1 or 2 foundation establishment pills. With this, the odds of entering foundation establishment were rather large. As for core formation, even with all of the above-mentioned circumstances, cultivators truly capable of entering core formation were few in number. Thus, every time a core formation cultivator appeared, almost every clan and sect would convene to celebrate without reserve. Furthermore, news of this would spread quickly throughout the cultivation world. The reason why the Masked Moon sect had become the #1 cultivation sect in the state of UA, apart from having over 1,000 foundation establishment disciples, a number that far exceeded that of other sects, was because they had more than 10 core formation experts. This allowed them to look down upon the other 6 sects with disdain. Han Li knew that his own aptitudes were disastrous, far below that of other formation establishment disciples. The only cultivation technique he possessed was a very dubious Azure Essence sword art, a cultivation technique he couldn't use under any circumstance. His current chances were as thin as a veil. He could only hope that his luck would fare better. As such, Han Li currently seemed to be at a complete disadvantage in all areas. But after a moment of pondering, Han Li felt that although his aptitude was rather poor, with the mysterious small bottle he possessed that could mature spirit medicines along with his skill at pill refinement, this was not an obstacle that could not be overcome. Also, destiny couldn't be grasped with a person's power, so he did not need to mull over it. All he could do was strive to increase his own chances of reaching core formation and find a suitable top-grade cultivation technique for his own use. With his goal set on finding a cultivation technique, Han Li first thought of his cheap master, Li Hueyuan. Although he had merely taken in Han Li as an in-name disciple, he should be willing to impart a few cultivation techniques to him. After all, he was a core formation expert. Perhaps Han Li could pick out a cultivation technique and even receive a pointer or two. With this thought, Han Li decided to return to Yellow Maple Valley the next morning and ask about the whereabouts of his master's Immortals cave to seek some instruction. It was highly likely that his master had yet to hear the news of his success in achieving foundation establishment. As he thought this, he found it truly funny. Ever since Li Hueyuan took him in, Han Li hadn't been called upon even a single time. It was as if this in-name disciple didn't exist at all, causing Han Li to feel upset. Naturally, as vexed as he was, Han Li couldn't take the initiative to call on him, and make his master feel like Han Li was being far too indiscreet. But now that Han Li had reached Foundation establishment, he could truly go to find this master of his. Even so, although he was his master's disciple, he would actually have to go and ask a few baffled strangers, much to his extreme embarrassment. Han Li laughed at himself for a moment before slowly falling asleep on his stone bed, with a bitter smile. After sleeping for an unknown amount of time, a sudden and intense quake forcefully roused Han Li from sleep. As he was still half asleep and did not fully understand the situation, he almost believed the quake was a dream of his. But another violent quake came, causing Han Li's last trace of sleepiness to disappear without a trace. Apart from the earth shaking, an explosive rupture came from outside his immortal's cave. It was clear that someone had touched his own restriction spell and was forcefully attacking his great restriction formation. Han Li was startled and furious. He immediately ran out of his bedroom and charged straight out of his immortal's cave. Outside the immortal's cave was a dense barrage of light arrows and beam attacks coming from several mechanical puppets floating in the sky. When Han Li saw this, he was so shocked that he nearly bit his own tongue. What was going on? Because he was afraid of attracting trouble, he didn't interfere with yesterday's matter. But after he returned to his home, they were actually able to find him. Furthermore, from their overbearing manner, it seemed they had some sort of misunderstanding. Could it be that when he flew away yesterday, they were able to track him? During this time of desperation, Han Li's mind was actually clear, and his mind produced several scheming responses one after another. The people inside had better listen well. Hand over the one who has escaped into your cave. So long as you hand over that person to us, we will not disturb this dwelling's master any further. These is no reason for your esteemed self to offend our 1,000 bamboo school and invite calamity by defending strangers. Even under these people's fierce, unrestrained assault, their attempt to dissolve the 5 elements reversal formation produced no visible effects. A man's persuasive voice came down from the sky, belonging to that person Huang Long. When Han Li heard this, he could not help but look up. In the patch of sky with the most puppets, a green jade raft was suspended in the air. There were 6 or 7 differently clothed individuals with Huang Long at the very front. Behind him were the man and woman Han Li had seen before, as well as 4 other slim men who looked completely similar. They were rarely seen quadruplets. It seemed they were reinforcements from the 1,000 bamboo school in a rush. When Han Li heard they wanted him to hand someone over, he was startled. With complete doubt, he looked toward the center of his 5 elements reversal formation and saw a still person lying face down near the entrance of his cave. It was unknown whether he was dead or alive. When Han Li saw this figure, the doubt in his stomach disappeared. He inwardly cursed without end. It seemed this senior martial brother Lin ran over here to escape and somehow entered Han Li's cave by mistake. As Han Li had attracted so much trouble toward him, how should he respond? But seeing how the great might of this damaged formation actually resisted such a berserk attack, Han Li felt much safer and wasn't as panicked as he was originally. Thus, after he wrinkled his brow, Han Li held the formation flag in hand and entered the formation spell, walking towards senior martial brother Lin. Han Li used both his hands to forcefully turn senior martial brother Lin onto his back. After carefully looking at his face, Han Li's expression immediately became unsightly, unable to say a single word. That was because he had no words to say to a dead man. With a jet-black face and trails of blood from his 7 orifices, this senior martial brother Lin had long since stopped breathing. Han Li let out a sigh. After a moment of hesitation, he reached out into the body's bosom. Han Li wanted to find the puppets in senior brother Lin's storage pouch, as he was greatly interested in these types of unfair methods of combat. But just as Han Li's hand opened the corpse's jacket, a faint green ball of light seized the opportunity to suddenly fly out and throw itself toward Han Li's face like a shooting star. Han Li shouted "Aya!" with fright, and his body fell backward. Just as the ball of light was heading toward Han Li's face, Han Li's right hand suddenly flashed with white light and shot forth like lightning, tightly grabbing hold of the green ball of light. The light ball that he grabbed seemed to moan in pain. "Junior Martial Brother, please spare my life. Junior Martial Brother, I was completely wronged by the Q clan and was forced without any other option. So long as Junior Martial Brother is willing to release me, I guarantee that Junior Martial Brother will receive enormous profit." Senior Martial Brother Lin's repentant voice entered Han Li's mind and promised great reward. "Did you try to possess my body just now?" Han Li ignored the enticement with a dark face. "This It was just as Junior Marshal Brother described it. However, I was confused during that time. I will certainly compensate Junior Marshal Brother for the fright. I wish that Sir Junior Marshal Brother will be gracious and will not stoop down to Senior Marshal Brother's level. Han Li heard Senior Marshal Brother Li's embarrassed response along with repeated apologies.